Hiccup pulled his phone back towards him and exited the video, a small smile on his face as he watched Astrid struggle over the revelation in the video. "You must think I'm the absolute worst wife ever. I can't believe I did that," Astrid complained to herself, cringing at her drunken acts. But Hiccup shook his head and just chuckled. "I don't think it's that bad," Hiccup remarked, looking at his phone in amusement before looking back over to Astrid. Raising her head slightly, Astrid met Hiccup's eyes with a hopeful smile. "Really? I mean, at least you've got your clothes on," Hiccup joked. "And besides, I never knew you could look so sexy without having to take anything off," Hiccup whispered in her ear before walking away, leaving Astrid with those words wandering around her head. Throughout the day, and the following day, neither Hiccup nor Astrid spoke one word to each other. They exchanged the odd pleasantry or polite "excuse me" when asking for something, but neither one spoke about what happened that Saturday morning in the kitchen. It was too much to admit for Astrid, and it certainly was too exciting for Hiccup to think about again. So, neither spoke about it nor thought about it. Instead, they chose to ignore one another, afraid that their close proximity to one another would spark another situation like it again. But Hiccup's words before the kiss weren't forgotten, not by Hiccup nor by Astrid. She remembered every word that had fallen from his mouth. In fact, it was those words that sparked that uncontrollable desire to kiss him and shut him up. Everything he had said to her at that moment, was everything she had always wanted to hear. Every word resonated with a deep part of her insecurities, to have someone who cared about her so much that they were angry enough to show their raw emotions to her. Yet, she was too blinded by his words to know what he had truly meant by them. He had wanted to protect her because he was jealous of the other men who would see her. To Astrid, that was something that made Hiccup a different man than she had ever thought of him before. So, on that Sunday afternoon, with the evening fast approaching, both Hiccup and Astrid sat in silence in the living room. No words were exchanged by the two of them as they looked at their laptops and went over their work. Astrid's father had sent Astrid some changes to his timetable as well as some paperwork that she needed to send over to a couple of co-workers for them to look over. It felt as though she was being flooded with the work that a secretary isn't meant to do, but being the hard-working employee she is, she did it anyway. Hiccup, meanwhile, was looking into Thorald's previous accounts and actions, trying to find evidence of his betrayal of the company. He scoured the internet and the company's archives for any information on Astrid's father, and perhaps a motive behind his schemes. But nothing. He was drawing up a blank down every route and getting stuck in a dead end. Momentarily drawing his attention away from the screen, Hiccup looked over to Astrid and noticed her let out a quiet yawn. Covering her mouth to the best of her abilities, she couldn't hide her tiredness but continued, powering through the remains of her energy that were like crumbs on the ground. Letting out an exhausted sigh, Hiccup placed the laptop down on the coffee table and stood up from the sofa. He disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, not that Astrid noticed, and reappeared with 2 mugs of coffee, the smell of which was completely alluring to anyone in the vicinity. Astrid's attention was grabbed when a mug of coffee was thrust into her peripheral vision with a caring hand extended towards her. Looking up at the coffee and then over to the server, Astrid met eyes with Hiccup for the first time after their moment in the kitchen. Smiling at her softly, Hiccup gestured to the coffee in his hand and offered it towards her hands. Here his voice was soft and gentle as it snapped Astrid from her trance and allowed her to grab the mug in her hands. The cup was hot from the boiling liquid inside, but the heat was welcome to Astrid's cold fingers that had been typing away at the keyboard for hours. She sipped the coffee slowly, enjoying the rich aroma and smooth taste of the coffee as it entered her mouth and caressed her taste buds. It felt like a caffeinated kiss. "Thanks," Astrid replied softly, her words barely audible after her blissful sip. But Hiccup heard it and smiled lightly at her appreciation. His eyes momentarily wandered over to her, scanning her figure as she hunched over her laptop once more. "Don't stay up too late working. If you're tired, go to bed, no need to stay up. If you collapse, I'll be worried," Hiccup told her concernedly. Astrid looked over at Hiccup with a curious glance, not fully understanding the meaning behind his words. But taking them for what they were, Astrid felt her heart warm at his thoughtfulness and smiled lightly to herself, trying not to show how his words were affecting her. "Okay. So long as you do the same." Chapter 28, Chapter 27. Chapter text. The journey to work the next morning was eerily quiet. Neither Hiccup nor Astrid spoke a word in the car ride over to their office building. The only words spoken by Hiccup that morning were to ask Astrid whether she still wanted a lift to work, to which she replied with a nod. Hiccup felt uncomfortably awkward sitting in the car that morning, no words being spoken to soothe the tension or to ease his awkwardness. Nothing. Not a word was spoken between them, and it was starting to annoy him. At the next traffic light, he looked over to Astrid, who had her head in her hand and looking out the window to the side of her. It seemed as though she was avoiding Hiccup's presence, despite how close she was to him. Astrid, Hiccup called out but got no answer. Groaning slightly, Hiccup turned back to the road in time to see the light turn green. Driving away, he gripped the steering wheel tighter. Astrid. He growled, desperate to hear her voice. We can't keep ignoring each other, Astrid, we have to talk together at some point. Please? Hiccup pleaded. But he continued to get no response. The silence was killing Astrid too. She did want to speak to ease the unbearable tension within the car, but her mind begged her not to. The fear of embarrassing herself or letting herself be vulnerable before Hiccup terrified her, so she continued to keep her mouth shut and stared out of the window. Astrid, please. Hiccup groaned, wanting to hear anything from his wife, but nothing. Soon, they arrived in the parking lot of their building and Hiccup found a parking space relatively quickly. However, before he could open his mouth and lock the doors, Astrid was already away and out of the car, storming over to the elevators. Hiccup hopped out of the car, locking it on his way away, and raced over to the elevator doors. Yet, as he reached them, he only had time to see them close before his eyes and Astrid's figure disappear behind them. He had lost her. Slamming his hand against the elevator in annoyance, Hiccup growled under his breath and cursed Astrid to the heavens. Why are you being like this? He cursed quietly, the question seeming more threatening than curious as he balled up his fists and waited impatiently for the elevator to arrive. Having finally escaped from Hiccup into the elevator, Astrid let out a heavy sigh and collapsed her weight onto the back wall of the elevator. Her gaze looked up to the numbers counting up from -2 on the screen and waited for the short ride to the ground floor. The day before, Astrid's father had told her that she would be needing to show around a new employee for their floor and his department. All Astrid needed to do was show him around the most important parts of the building and then bring him to her father's office at noon. Glancing at her watch, Astrid knew she had plenty of time to take him around the office building as she realized she had around 3 hours to show him around. She had no idea what this new employee would be undertaking, or who he will be replacing. But Astrid had to follow her father's orders, despite their absurdity sometimes, and took in another deep breath. It's just like any other day, Astrid told herself as the elevator doors pinged open and slowly revealed the ground entrance hall to the office building. The ground floor entrance hall was one enormous room with many elevators coming off of it. There were only a few that went from the underground parking lot to the rest of the building. But as Astrid stepped out of the elevator, she made her way over to the front desk, which was the central piece to the hall. It was a circular desk that had around 4 attendants manning it at any one time, and each side had specific requirements. Astrid strode up to the desk facing away from the door and smiled at the attendant behind it. She had known this woman when she had first started working, but both of them had grown apart as her father became higher up in the company. Astrid smiled at the woman, but she didn't smile back. "Morning, Camille." Astrid greeted brightly, with a friendly smile plastered on her face. Camille looked uninterested as she continued to stare at her computer screen in bored interest. Astrid rolled her eyes at Camille's ignorance and just shrugged. "Has a man going by Ret Sonaret come by?" Astrid asked nicely, trying to maintain her composure. "Don't know," Camille shrugged, "but even if they had, I'm not sure I like you enough to tell you." She countered nonchalantly, not sparing Astrid a glance as she wounded her pride. "That's me." A male, impressive voice called out to them, gaining both women's attention. Turning around, Astrid was faced with a tall man with a large chin and slick, jet black hair smoothed back over his head. His chest was puffed out exaggeratedly, and his muscles seemed to ripple with every breath he took. His muscles seemed to be straining against the threads of his suit as he strode boldly over to Astrid. He had a bright, intimidating smile on his face as he stood before her, his eyes scanning over her figure in an appreciative glance. He held out a hand to her and all intimidation and fear Astrid felt towards the man melted away in an instant. The name's Irette Sonaret. Nice to meet you, young lady. Irette waited for Astrid to take his hand in hers, which she did graciously with a tough grip and shook it gently. Yes, nice to meet you too, Astrid replied, swiftly letting go of his hand as she felt her palm climb up from the hot touch of his hand. Irette reminded Astrid of every bad decision she had ever made in a relationship, but the attraction and desire for the relationship were still there. Astrid couldn't deny that the man was good-looking, and any woman would be dropping to their knees if he so much as asked. But Astrid knew that there was something about him that was missing, and it was something that Hiccup had. Come with me, Astrid began, gesturing behind her in a kind gesture. I'll show you around, as Thorold may have told you. I'm his secretary, Astrid. She paused, almost wanting to say her family name, but she stopped herself. Haddock. Cammie's eyes went wide, having clearly not heard about her old forward/ex-friend's arranged marriage to the chairman's son. However, she didn't miss the slight reluctance in her voice as she announced her surname. But Cammie chalked that up to not being used to using Hiccup's name after such a short time. Nice to meet you, Miss Haddock. Please, call me Astrid. Astrid smiled up at the tall man before her, her head craning up slightly to meet his gaze as he looked down at her with a gracious smile. He nodded in understanding and followed her as she led him away from the desk and towards the elevators. I'll take you to your floor first. Floor 33, right? Astrid asked as she strode confidently into the elevator, whipping her hair around her as she turned to face Irette with a friendly smile. When she turned, she noticed his gaze look up from somewhere else. Clearly, his focus had been on something else until she had faced him, but Astrid shrugged it off. Irette met her gaze and gave her a thoughtful nod. He patiently stood beside her in the elevator as they waited for it to ascend, the slow movements making their time more awkward. So, what's a beautiful woman like you doing in such a place like this? Irette asked casually, a slightly alluring tone to his voice as his eyes continued to admire Astrid's figure. My father gave me a job, and the pay is good. Although it's not really what I want to do, it'll do for now. Astrid shrugged, happy to admit that she doesn't like her current job. But who does? You ever thought about being a model? Irette questioned, causing Astrid's brow to furrow curiously and uncomfortably as she turned to face him. I know a few people in that industry that are looking for a girl like you. Perhaps I could put in a good word for you. Irette suggested, a friendly smile plastered on his face but a sinister look hid behind his eyes. Astrid rolled her eyes, finally understanding where his words were going. She let out a small chuckle, amused by the man's belief that she would fall for his blatant lies like a desperate hormonal teen. Shaking her head lightly, she turned to the man and held up her hand, proudly showing off the wedding ring that she often forgot she wore. Sorry, I'm taken. You'll have to use your pickup lines on someone else. Astrid shot him down abruptly, fanning the ring in his face like a single-man repellent. Irette suddenly shrunk and his demeanor immediately changed, his intimidating aura turning shy as he avoided her gaze. The action amused Astrid as she noticed his sheepish expression and nervous twitches as he looked away. Oh, I see. You caught that, huh? Irette spoke nervously, suddenly afraid of what Astrid would think of him now that he knew his womanizing charms had no effect. Look, I wasn't trying to trick you or anything to get me the job, I just thought that. Astrid held up a hand and stopped his words, her eyes looking up at the counting numbers and realized they only had a few seconds of elevator ride left. I'm flattered that you wanted to try and sleep with me, but I'm not all that important in this building for you to even think that it would get you anywhere. I know men like you, only in it for the bragging rights. Astrid turned to look at him with a harsh, pointed stare. Someday you're going to realize all you will ever get is bragging rights in a battle that no one cares about, and the only person you can brag about it to, is yourself. With that, the doors of the elevator opened and Astrid stepped out confidently, the clicking of her heels echoing down the hallway as she left Irette speechless. Irette quickly caught up and continued to follow Astrid around the building like a waddling duckling, staying within 3 feet of Astrid at all times, sometimes getting a bit too close. But Astrid showed him around the building, pointing out useful things and showing him the important places in the building. As they walked down a narrow corridor, someone with a cleaning trolley was making their way down the corridor towards Astrid and Irette at the same time. Astrid hadn't noticed the cart as she was talking to Irette about certain duties he needed to be aware of, so she didn't see when the cart was about to collide with her. However, Irette had. Thinking on his feet, he grabbed Astrid by the waist and pulled her towards him, spinning them around so that his back was against the trolley and shielding Astrid from the onslaught of the collision. When it passed, Irette found himself pushed back harshly and violently colliding with the wall behind him. Astrid hadn't really had time to decode what had just happened before Irette was roughly dragged away from her and thrown across the corridor by a familiar auburn-haired man. His expression was furious and his fists looked as though they were about to destroy the man who had just touched Astrid. "Stay the hell away from my wife." Hiccup's voice boomed out in the corridor, causing an instant reaction from Astrid as she sensed a sinister tone in his voice. She leapt up off of the wall and grabbed hastily onto Hiccup's arm, pulling him back. "Hiccup, stop. He was just making sure I wasn't hurt by that cart," Astrid pleaded, seeing the crashed cart and realizing why Irette had pinned her to the wall so suddenly. However, Hiccup had seen it as a challenge. So, he stared at Irette with a piercing, fiery stare before grabbing onto Astrid's arm with an iron grip and began dragging her away towards his office. Never saying a word, Astrid found herself flung into his office but didn't lose her footing as Hiccup threw her into his office. He slammed the door behind him and locked it. He strode over to his desk and slammed his fist down onto the solid surface, the anger radiating off of him like fire. "Sit down," he ordered harshly, making Astrid hurry over to the chair that sat in front of his desk and take a seat. "What the hell was that about?" Hiccup yelled, still standing up and towering over Astrid as she cowered beneath him on her seat. She had never seen Hiccup this upset before. "Hiccup, calm down. It was nothing. Nothing." Hiccup slammed his fist down on the desk again. "He pinned you against a wall, his hands were on you. And you tell me it was nothing?" Hiccup asked furiously, his eyes turning red in anger. "Yes, it was nothing. You are being unreasonable, Hiccup. He was getting me out of the way of that trolley that would have hit me otherwise. There was no need to touch you that much though. He could have just warned you." Hiccup muttered under his breath, but Astrid caught his words and smiled. "Were you jealous?" Astrid teased lightly, Hiccup's expression flattered slightly as Astrid beamed at him with a bright smile. "That's not important. What I'm saying is that he shouldn't have been touching you like that," Hiccup argued, but Astrid's light giggle distracted him. "What?" "Nothing," she shrugged, a small laugh still evident in her voice. "It's just that, you're slightly cute when you get so protective and jealous like that." "Astrid, come on, this is serious." "What?" "It's not like he kissed me or anything, so what's the big deal?" "Yeah, 'cause if he kissed you, you would have ignored him for as long as possible until you were forced to talk to each other again," Hiccup muttered, looking away from Astrid for a moment as he spoke. "Low blow, Hiccup. Real low. What am I supposed to say, Astrid? How am I supposed to talk to you when you act so immature like this?" Hiccup stood up properly and made his way over to the window by the desk, looking out onto the streets below and the rooftops surrounding them. "What am I supposed to think about you every time you throw yourself at me, and then run away afterwards? How else am I supposed to take that apart from very saltily?" Hiccup argued, his arms crossing across his chest defensively. Astrid looked down at her lap, her fingers linked together as she thought back over those moments for the first time since they happened. That was exactly what she had done, and she hadn't even realized how that looked. "I mean, I even saw a drunk you throwing yourself at the nearest guy who would dance with you. Yet, you won't even give me a second glance," Hiccup commented, a sense of hurt evident in his voice. "You're just not being fair, Astrid." "I'm sorry, Hiccup. I didn't mean to make you feel like that, it's just. I just get scared when things start getting real. When it's a drunken act, I know it won't mean anything in the morning. But ask all my previous boyfriends. Whenever things went from casual to real, I ran away and pretended like we never got to that stage. It's what I do," Astrid admitted sadly, not daring to look Hiccup's way. "I get it, this isn't supposed to be real. But we keep making it real." Hiccup sighed. "I guess we could set up some proper boundaries to prevent this from escalating. I want us to be friends, to be whatever you want us to be, Astrid. But I can't do that if you keep throwing mixed signals my way and then running away. So please, stay with me until the end. Hiccup pleaded desperately, turning back around to face Astrid with a sympathetic look. Astrid looked up to meet his gaze and felt a part of her melt. Okay. I'm with you. Good, think it over for today and we'll talk again tonight. Deal. Deal. Chapter 29, Chapter 28. Chapter text. The car was silent as Hiccup drove both him and Astrid home that evening. The words from their argument earlier that day were still fresh in their minds as the car zoomed across the roads towards home. Astrid didn't bother looking at Hiccup, too focused and lost in her own mind as she thought about his words. She had come up with a small list of boundaries to be set between them, however, her mind was beginning to regret some of her choices. Was she perhaps being too strict with them? Are you okay? Hiccup asked, breaking through the silence and reaching Astrid's ears. She snapped her head up and looked over to him with a smile and a small nod. Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I be? She replied nervously, roughly rubbing her thighs with her palms to erase the clammy feeling on her palms. Hiccup chuckled at her actions, turning the wheel around as he turned them into their driveway and soon parked the car. Looking over at Astrid, he could tell she was nervous and unsure of herself, something in her holding her back from being truthful with herself. However, Hiccup didn't push her. Come on then, let's go inside. Walking into the house, Hiccup placed his coat on the coat rack and made his way up to his room, eager to change out of his work clothes and into something more comfortable. Astrid followed him and made her way into her room opposite Hiccup's. As she changed into her comfortable clothes, a sense of nervousness and anxiety filled her stomach as she looked at her reflection. How am I supposed to bring up the whole boundary list thing up to Hiccup? She asked herself worriedly, nervous about the conversation they were bound to have. The concept was inevitable. Sighing heavily, Astrid decided to leave it for now and just ignore it for as long as she could, knowing that if Hiccup wanted to talk about it, he would be the one to bring it up. So, Astrid hibernated in her room for the next few hours, scrolling through social media on her phone and looking through her timetable for the coming week. Hours had passed and the rumbling of her stomach snapped Astrid out of her focused procrastinating. Guess I'd better get something to eat. Astrid hauled herself off of her perch and strode out into the hallway, pausing slightly outside Hiccup's door. Her gaze lingered there for a moment before she shrugged it off and decided to pay no attention to it. Hiccup will talk to her when he wants to talk to her. Making her way down the stairs, Astrid felt a swirl of butterflies enter her stomach and she suddenly wasn't feeling very hungry. But she made her way downstairs anyway and soon arrived at the kitchen, which was empty. Astrid furrowed her brow at the emptiness of the vacant kitchen and her eyes wandered around the unoccupied space. Where's Hiccup? She wondered as her eyes scanned the room. Soon, her eyes fell upon a scrap of paper that was left on the kitchen island. Her curiosity getting the better of her, Astrid strode over and picked it up with an eager hand. Looking at the handwriting, she knew it was from Hiccup and the name printed at the top made Astrid sure it was for her. Come outside to the veranda. That was all that was written there. The veranda. Astrid asked herself, furrowing her brows in confusion as she reread the note. Why does he want to meet there? She asked again, still confused about Hiccup's mysterious note. Shrugging her shoulders, Astrid placed the note back down on the island and made her way out to the veranda. The only way to get there through the house was to enter the dining room and exit through the well-disguised glass doors that lined the back wall of the house. As Astrid entered the dining room, she noticed that the curtains that covered the windows were askew and haphazardly thrown back. Opening the doors to the outside, Astrid was met with a cool breeze hitting her face and a beautiful warm glow of light shining down from above. Hiccup was sat by a small fire pit that he had managed to set up and was arranging a small platter on a coffee table that he had managed to haul outside. As he heard the doors open, Hiccup's head shot up and he faced Astrid with a smile and gestured to the garden wicker chair next to him with a welcome hand. Astrid smiled back and strode over to join him, placing herself down on the wicker armchair that he had provided for her whilst he sat in one of his own. You got my note? Hiccup asked as he returned his focus to the platter, reaching for a bottle of wine and 2 glasses he had already brought out in preparation. Yes, why else would I be here? Although, the only question I have at the moment is about your motives, Why here? Astrid asked as she looked above her at the pretty fairy lights that hung overhead. Their warm glow and dim lights made this scene more romantic than if they had just had a dinner like this inside. Well, I wanted to say sorry about earlier. You were right, I was out of line and pushing my boundaries. Hiccup admitted sadly, shaking his head solemnly as he avoided Astrid's gaze. She smiled at his regretful look and felt her heart warm by his gesture. About that. Astrid rubbed her thighs nervously, turning to her back pocket and fishing out a small note. You said we should come up with some boundaries for our relationship. Okay. Hiccup replied hesitantly, not sure where she was going with this. Well, I just made a short list of possible ideas for boundaries, and in fact she opened up the note and looked down at the list carefully, searching for a particular item. Ah. Here she pointed to one of the ideas on the list. Stop making big, romantic, or generous gestures as an apology. She announced, reading the idea and slowly looking up apologetically to Hiccup. Do I really make that many that you have to write it down as a boundary? Hiccup asked, slightly amused by the idea. Well, not really, but when you make them I can't help but forgive whatever heinous thing you've done. Things like this, she gestures to the atmosphere and lights around her, make you seem so sweet and romantic, and that's what I want to stop. It's not fair on my heart to have to tell myself that this isn't real, every time. I mean, I don't think I've made you any big romantic gestures like this before. Hiccup thought back, questioning what he had done before to apologize to Astrid. But nothing came to mind. The coffee cup, Astrid replied stoically, her words short and stiff as she admitted the gesture was romantic. Hiccup's eyes widened as a sense of realization came over him. Oh, that. Was that really that romantic? Maybe not to this scale, but it was romantic. Yes. Astrid replied. And it's not fair on my heart to make it race and hope like this. I know it's not real, but my heart doesn't. Hiccup sighed, feeling his heart grow heavy with her words. He didn't realize that his small gestures, like this, had such an impact upon her that she felt hurt by it every time. Maybe he wasn't being as sweet and thoughtful as he had hoped. But her words caused his mind to cast itself back to their moment in the kitchen. Then his soft and genuine words had caused such a dramatic and passionate reaction from Astrid. Did he have that big of an impact on her? I'm sorry. I didn't realize you felt like that. He lowered his head, avoiding her face as she hung a solemn expression upon her face. No, it's okay. I guess you've made a list of boundaries too, right? Astrid asked hopefully, raising her gaze to look upon Hiccup, who continued to avoid her gaze. However, she noticed a small wince cross his face as a look of regret and disagreement rested there for a moment. You did write a list too, didn't you? She asked again, still not getting a response. Well. I just didn't think I needed to. Hiccup replied shyly, his voice barely audible as he faced away from Astrid with a fearful look. You didn't think you needed to? Why? Astrid asked accusingly, a hint of anger crossing her voice as she stared at Hiccup with a piercing gaze. Hiccup cowered more into himself as he looked away and avoided Astrid's stare. Because I don't have any boundaries with you. Everything went quiet between them. I consider you someone I want to be really close friends with, where stuff like holding hands and kissing is something we can do in public to prove that we are in a relationship, without making it weird. Hiccup sighed and shrugged his shoulders. But maybe that's just me. You were the one who said that we were going to end this whole thing after a year. Are you going back on your words now? No. Hiccup held his hands up in defense, finally looking up to meet Astrid's eyes. No, I never go back on my word. Well then, by that logic you should have made yourself a boundary list like you suggested us to. Astrid crossed her arms victoriously, knowing she had caught him in a loo. Hiccup sighed and shook his head sadly. All right, you got me there. But, let me see it, Hiccup asked, holding out his hand to receive the list. However, Astrid hesitated. Come on, I won't judge you for whatever you've written. I will just agree or disagree with whatever I think is fair. Hiccup countered with an open mind, kindly offering Astrid an out. Giving in, Astrid handed Hiccup her list with a resigned sigh and turned herself to the wine glass that was placed on the coffee table before her. Taking a ruminative sip, She eyed up Hiccup's expression as he read through the ideas on the list carefully. Interesting. He muttered to himself, lingering over a few of the ideas for a few moments longer as the ideas entered circulation through his brain. Astrid raised her head and looked at him with a quizzical look, curious as to his reaction. What's interesting? She asked hesitantly, a hint of nervousness entering her voice as she focused her gaze on him. Hiccup looked up and met her gaze. I agree with 3 out of the 7 ideas you have here. Hiccup announced confidently. His bold declaration caused Astrid to cross her arms inquisitively and sent him a curious glance. Only 3? Yeah. Okay. Hiccup readjusted his seat and leaned forward, opening up the list so that both he and Astrid could read it together. Number 1, no kissing. Fair enough, that is a valid point and one that I agree with. Hiccup pointed at the sentence and nodded along with his words. Astrid's eyes focused on the paper and followed Hiccup's finger as he went down the list. Number 2, no unnecessary physical contact. What do you mean? Like no touching whatsoever? Hiccup asked curiously, his eyebrows furrowing deeply as he peered at Astrid, who just rolled her eyes exasperatedly. It means what it means. Unless we have to touch to prove that we're in a relationship, we don't hug, hold hands, kiss, lie next to one another, all stuff like that. Astrid explained, as though it was the simplest thing to understand. Hiccup hummed and nodded in understanding, even though his mind scoffed at the idea. Okay, well I don't necessarily agree with that one. Hiccup muttered before making his way down the page to the next one. Okay, number 3, no big, romantic, or sweet gestures. Like this. Hiccup gestures to the lights and the setup surrounding them, the warm lighting illuminating their faces in the darkness. Is this your example? He asked, still gesturing to the lights and the wine and the food. Yes. Astrid nodded, avoiding Hiccup's judging stare. Yes, this is what I mean. Okay. I don't know about that one, because this is just something I do when I've done something so bad that it requires an extreme, grandiose apology. I'm sorry you don't like it. It's not that I don't like it, Hiccup. Astrid started sadly, holding her knees with her hands as she squeezed the joint nervously. I just don't want you to apologize like this every time you do something wrong. I'm not that hard to talk to. Just apologize to me with your words, as a normal person would. Astrid explained, shrugging sadly as she tried to articulate her thoughts properly. Hiccup nodded sagely and turned back to the page. Number 4, no nicknames. Now this one, I can't do. I know for a fact that you like my nickname for you, so don't lie to me. Hiccup announced boldly, his words hanging in the air like an accusation, and Astrid suddenly felt very small. Why have you written this one? Astrid shrunk into her seat, her shoulders rising and attempting to turtle her head into her body. But it wasn't working. Hiccup was staring at her with a demanding but curious look, and Astrid suddenly forgot how to speak. Well, friends don't really call each other nicknames, do they? I just don't like you calling me nicknames sometimes. Astrid admitted with a non-committal reply. Hiccup chuckled lightly at her words, slowly shaking his head. Friends do call each other nicknames on occasion. But if you don't like them, fine. Which ones don't you like? Milady. Astrid replied quickly, her heart jumping into her throat momentarily as she spoke. Nope. Can't not call you that when I get a reaction like that every time. You can lie to yourself that you don't like it, milady. But I know you do. Hiccup smirked, eyeing up Astrid's figure as she felt her skin heat up from his words. The nickname always sparked something within her, but she never knew what. Fine, you can call me that. But not princess, or sweetie, or honey, or babe. Nothing like that. Okay. Astrid countered, offering a new and improved boundary to the list. Hiccup smiled and gave her a swift nod in agreement. All right. Next one. Number 5, no bed sharing or sleeping in the same room. Agreeable. I have no qualms about that. Very understandable. Number 6, be open about what's going on in our minds and whether we are bothered by something. What do you mean? I don't want either of us to hide anything from the other. If you are upset or angry about something, whether it's because of me or someone else, I want to know. That way, We aren't taking our anger out on each other and we don't become sick of each other whilst trying to live together for the next year. Astrid shrugged nonchalantly, her voice smooth and gentle as she explained her reasoning behind the idea. Hiccup smiled at her words and nodded along with her explanation. His understanding became clearer and his heart warmed at her words. Okay, yeah. I like that. Hiccup smiled and gave Astrid a warm glance as he returned his gaze to the page. And finally, number 7. No falling in love. Hiccup's voice slightly cracked as he spoke the words themselves dying in his throat as they left his mouth. Astrid felt her heart ache slightly as the words left Hiccup's mouth, the idea slightly wounding her as the words made it more real. But it had to be said. To avoid pain and heartbreak in the future. Yes. No falling in love. That one is the most important, I think. Astrid agreed quietly, rubbing her legs nervously as a small silence settled between the both of them. Hiccup knew he had to agree, otherwise, things would become extremely complicated. But he knew he was going to start this list by already having broken one rule. Hiccup looked over to Astrid and saw her gaze directed at the floor, knowing how weird the rule must sound, but her desperation to avoid pain and heartbreak was genuine. It was there. Okay. I agree. So, you agree with all of them? Astrid asked, a curious, quizzical look passing over her face. Hiccup let out a short chuckle and slowly shook his head. No, not all of them. But how about this? Hiccup leaned over onto the table and retrieved a pen from his pocket. As he placed the paper on the table, he began adjusting the ideas and created a new list of boundaries for them to follow. No kissing. No big, romantic or sweet gestures. No bed sharing, or sleeping in the same room unless necessary. Always be open about our thoughts and emotions. No falling in love. Hiccup clicked the pen closed and looked over to Astrid with a victorious grin. Agreed. Astrid nodded with a small smile, a hint of regret and hesitation behind her eyes. Agreed. Great. Hiccup announced and collapsed fully into his seat, enjoying the night sky above him. I love watching the stars, they are so beautiful. Hiccup smiled, admiring the small lights dotting the sky above. Astrid followed his gaze and looked at the sky with a curious gaze. You think so? Yeah, even though they're 1,000, often 1,000,000, miles away. They always appear if you're willing to look. Besides, Hiccup sighed deeply, my dad always told me that the stars can represent our loved ones if they have passed. Somewhere up there, my mother is watching over me and guiding me along my way. Hiccup sighed again, the memory causing his heart to grow heavy. I've always liked the moon, Astrid interjected, pulling Hiccup out of his deep thoughts. It's like nature's nightlight. Always there to light up your way in the darkness. Astrid smiled, turning her gaze to the moon that was beginning to loom overhead. When I was little, I believed that there was a dinosaur on the moon because if you look closely at the dark coloration of the craters, they make out the vague shape of a T-Rex, don't you think? Hiccup gave Astrid a curious, amused expression before looking back up into the sky. His eyes met the moon and he scanned it closely, trying to see what she could see. But he could not, he only saw the odd formation of the craters, but no dinosaurs. No, I don't see that when I look at the moon. Hiccup replied, his brow furrowed but his interest piqued. I guess we all think and believe different things about the night sky. It's what makes each of us unique, wouldn't you say? I definitely would. Hiccup chuckled to himself lightly. At least we can agree with each other on one thing. Chapter 30, Chapter 29. Chapter text. So, tell me, Hiccup said, placing his wine glass down on the table with a wry smile. What are some of your favorite things? What do you like? Hiccup asked curiously, raising an eyebrow over at Astrid, who paused momentarily from the question. I don't know, I haven't really ever thought about it. She pondered, her mind going blank from concentration as she tried to focus on what she liked most. But it wasn't working. Okay, what's your favorite food? Hiccup asked simply, throwing a lifeline towards Astrid, who accepted it graciously. Smiling, she leaned forward and grabbed her wine glass, swirling the liquid around in the glass contemplative. I guess if I had to decide, it would probably be steak. Like a really juicy, medium rare steak. Like a ribeye steak. Yeah, obviously. That's the best kind. I mean, there are other types of steak, but I would say the ribeye ones have more flavor and texture to them. Astrid explained, her mouth began watering at the thought of the delicious steak on a plate before her, the types of side dishes filling her mind as her stomach growled. Ah! I'm growing hungry just thinking about them. Yeah, I would have to agree with you. I think my favorite food is a tie between steak and seafood. Hiccup replied, leaning back in his chair, his eyes facing the sky as he thought the idea over in his head. Astrid took a small sip from her glass and tilted her head in curiosity. What type of seafood? Sushi? Mussels? Lobster? What are we talking about here? Astrid prodded, asking for a more descriptive answer from Hiccup as he thought it over. I don't know. Just any kind of seafood. Any fish or sea creature you put before me that's already a well-known dish, I would enjoy. Hiccup replied with a small shrug of his shoulders, his open answer not fully satisfying Astrid, but she allowed him to get away with it. Is there any type of fish that you don't like? Astrid asked, sure she could find a hole in his answer. Hiccup's brow furrowed in thought as he searched for an answer. Eel. I don't like eel much. Hiccup answered confidently, turning to Astrid with a victorious smile. A smile which she returned. Same, I don't really like eel either. I find it too watery and just. Yuck. Astrid shivered as she thought back to the last time she had eel. Hiccup chuckled at Astrid's reaction to her traumatic memory and smiled to himself, taking a sip from his glass of wine. Is there anything else that you don't like? Anything else? Astrid placed her finger on her chin cinematically, ruminating over the question as she thought about it deeply. Classical music is something I have absolutely no time for. I have always found it boring as hell, and I find it's not easy listening. Astrid replied, nodding affirmatively to her answer, sure that answered Hiccup's question. Classical music. Okay, you more of a rock band, heavy metal kind of girl then. Hiccup chuckled lightly, a smile spreading across his lips as he tried to imagine Astrid jamming to a heavy metal album in her room as a teenager. What? No. Astrid defended, placing her glass on the table as she waved off Hiccup's ridiculous idea. No, I like the indie stuff, like guitar and electronica music. Those are the kinds of music that I find easy to listen to. More so than classical music. Astrid replied, shaking her head at the thought of her listening to heavy metal. The thought slightly disgusted her. Really? Wouldn't have pegged you for an indie band kind of girl either. I guess I don't know you at all. I guess you don't. Astrid chuckled, laughing along with Hiccup, who gave her an amused smile. He nodded along with her words and let out a small sigh as he shook his head sadly. But what about you? Are you a rock band kind of guy? Maybe a grunge type? Astrid teased, chuckling at her questions as she prodded him again. What? No. I'm not into that kind of stuff. No, I think I'm the same as you. You like indie stuff? Sorta. I guess I like the kind of live jazz and piano stuff they play in piano bars. I like that sort of stuff, you know. The easy listening types. I guess indie is kind of in that area of easy listening, but I don't hate any genre of music, just strongly dislike them. Hiccup answered, his mouth moving without much thought as he allowed his tongue to spill out anything that Astrid would want to hear. Wow, guess I was also wrong about you. Guess we have something in common. What about animals? What's your favorite pet? Hiccup asked suddenly, a question flashing across his brain as he looked up to meet Astrid's eye. She smiled and chuckled at his quick words and sudden movements. Oh. I guess dogs are my favorite animal. I've always wanted a dog. Really? Hiccup queried, intrigued by the idea and leaning closer to her in an interested manner. What kind of dog would you get if you could get one? Hiccup asked, tilting his head questioningly as he peered at Astrid's face. Probably a golden retriever. Or a Labrador. I like those big dogs, especially the ones with white or golden coats. I think they're really beautiful. What would you call it? Stormfly. I thought about the name a lot. After all, waiting until I get a dog allows me enough time to come up with a name for one. Astrid replied with a smile, proud of her chosen name for her non-existent dog. Hiccup nodded, liking the name of her imaginative dog. I like it, I think it's quite cool. I would call mine Toothless. It would be a black dog, doesn't matter what breed, I think they are all beautiful and unique in their own ways. Why would you call it Toothless though? Dogs have teeth. And sharp ones at that. Hiccup shrugged gently, pouting slightly in a non-committal way. I don't know, for the ironic appeal, I guess. There are people out there who give their dogs curious pun names when it's not even funny. Like Sir Barks-a-Lot, or Jitterklug. I just thought I'd go for a hilariously ironic name. It suits my style. Hiccup explained nonchalantly. Astrid smiled as she found some amusement in the idea and agreed with Hiccup. That is a little funny, to be fair. There was a small pause between them as Hiccup's words floated in the air between them. Really? Jitterklug. Where did you get that from? Astrid chuckled, the name standing out to her with its weirdly hilarious name. I don't know. Hiccup laughed along with her. I think I've heard it somewhere before. Maybe off the internet, who knows? He chuckled, shaking his head at the absurd name. Their laughter died down and the atmosphere returned to quiet, neither one of them speaking as they sat drinking their wine. Astrid watched Hiccup take a sip from his glass and watched as his Adam's apple bobbed the liquid down his throat. She didn't want to admit it, but it was rather attractive to watch, and she had to tear her gaze away so that she didn't jump him right that second. What about crafts? Are you particularly creative? Hiccup asked curiously, trying to delve deeper into this conversation that he had been offered. This was a rare chance to get an insight into Astrid's closed doors, and he was finally getting a peek behind them. Not particularly. I can appreciate a good work of art. But I'm not particularly crafty myself. I mean, you've seen me draw. Have you ever tried to be crafty? I had a group art project in high school, but I was chosen to write about the project rather than participate in the crafting. So, I think that's a testament to how much I suck at art. Astrid replied with a resentful look passing over her face, her eyes darting down to her fingers as she played with them forcefully. I'd disagree. Astrid looked up. I've seen your art. You're not an amazing, diamond-in-the-rough artist, but you have some skill. If you learned how to master and practice it, I'm sure you'd be amazing. Perhaps they didn't want you to help with the project because they were scared that your part would outshine theirs. Hiccup suggested, passing her a knowing glance and a friendly smile. Thanks, but it's still not my thing. Is it yours? I noticed how good your drawing of me was. I've always loved drawing. But I'm more into the inventing and crafting side of things, like an engineer. But I have never really explored as much of that path as I would have liked. It wasn't meant for me. Hiccup shrugged. I've always wanted to make something for someone that they love and treasure, like a bracelet or a necklace or a pair of earrings. Something small and intricate that I can make for them. That will be my greatest achievement. Hiccup mentioned, waffling on much more than he needed to, but his words warmed Astrid's heart as she noticed his melancholic expression as he spoke about it. Hey, I've always wanted those couples necklaces, you know the ones. The ones that connect together. But I've always wanted it whereby it had a nickname for me on one and a nickname for him on the other. Astrid smiled, daydreaming aloud as she looked off into the middle distance. The picture of the necklaces seemed so vivid in her mind, her imagination creating them into two beautiful masterpieces. That sounds beautiful, Astrid. Hiccup whispered, watching her dreamy expression with an admiring expression. Hiccup glanced down at his watch and let out a long, tired sigh. Well, it's getting late. We'd better head to bed. Hiccup announced, climbing out of his chair. Astrid followed him and stood up, retrieving her wine glass as she arose. Hiccup sidled past her and made his way over to the door, holding it open for Astrid. Good night. Astrid smiled as she passed him and made her way up the stairs after leaving the wine glass in the kitchen. Chapter 31, Chapter 30. Chapter text. The walk down to Stoic's office always seemed longer than it actually was. Hiccup often counted the offices that he walked past as a way of counting down until he arrived in front of his father's office. He remembered the 25 offices from his office to his father's. Although he didn't know every occupant, he remembered them and their interior as if he did. Hiccup sighed quietly to himself as he counted the 25th office and turned the corner to face his father's office. The door looked in front of him as if it were his father, but Hiccup was more intimidated by the name stuck to the front of the door. Stoic Haddock. The name always filled Hiccup with dread. How was he expected to live up to a name like that? The thought terrified him beyond belief, but that was his reality. Raising his hand hesitantly, Hiccup knocked on the office door loud enough that the echo continued in the hallway for a few seconds longer than in the office. Hiccup could barely hear his father's voice bellowing over the loud knock that Hiccup had sounded as his fist had connected with the door. His father's voice still reached his ears and Hiccup felt his heart drop and a sense of nervousness and anxiety flow through his body, crippling him. Hesitantly, Hiccup turned the handle and opened the large door into Stoic's office, revealing the large, open and grand office that Stoic resided in. His desk sat facing the door, at the far end of the office and up a few steps to tower him above the others, insinuating his power over others. Soon, this large, decadent office would be Hiccup's, and that thought filled him with dread as he sauntered up to his father's desk. "Father?" Hiccup asked, causing Stoic's head to raise, a furrowed brow and annoyed expression still evident on his face as he tried to wipe it away with a smile. "Son," he announced, a broad, happy smile spreading across his face as he looked at his son standing before him in his office. Hiccup rarely visited his father during work hours, and they only ever saw each other if Stoic needed his help or if they were in a meeting together. They used to spend a lot of their working day together when Stoic was training Hiccup as an intern, to show him the ropes and the methods of the company. Hiccup hadn't enjoyed his time as Stoic's intern / protege, but he had put up with it. He needed to. "Why did you call me here? I don't expect it's just because you missed me." Hiccup joked as he took a seat in front of Stoic's desk, facing his father who sat just on the other side. Even though there was just a desk between them, Hiccup always felt very far away from his father when he sat in front of Stoic's desk like this. Stoic's bold and intimidating aura as he sat behind the desk, always disturbed Hiccup. His father sat with a disappointed look on his face whenever Hiccup sat in front of him, looking at his son as though he would rather anyone sit there in his office. However, as Hiccup sat there that day, he saw no evidence of that face on his father. "No, although I would love it to be for that reason. It's not, I'm afraid." Stoic gave a long, exhausted sigh and lowered his gaze. He linked his fingers together and placed them on the table, resting there whilst holding up his body as he relaxed his intimidating stature. "What's it about? You were right. I should have believed you more," Stoic admitted, shaking his head solemnly as he admitted his regret. Hiccup's brow furrowed slightly as his father's words confused him. "What are you talking about?" "The members of the board. They are losing faith in me, and my support on the board is dwindling. I think somebody is targeting me, trying to have me voted off the board and give up the company." Stoic sighed, the weight heavy on his shoulders as the bags under his eyes darkened underneath the bright light of his office. "How do you know this?" Hiccup asked, wondering who warned him of this outcome. Who did Stoic believe more than his own son? "Spitaloot. He told me that he could no longer support my work and power on the board. He will be voting against me in the next vote of confidence." Hiccup felt his heart wrench slightly at his father's words. He knew how much this hurt his father, and he could tell the wound that was cutting into him was a deep one. Hiccup felt helpless as he watched the floor beneath Stoic's feet crumble and his tower of pride began decaying and breaking underneath him. It seemed like there was nothing he could do. "What about Gobber?" "Oh, Gobber's retired now. I took your advice on him and we sped up his retirement. He should be relaxing nicely on a beach in Menorca by now. I'm jealous." Stoic sighed wistfully, leaning back in his seat slightly as he thought about the joys and relaxation his friend must be experiencing at that moment. "Do you know who's behind it? Did Spitaloot tell you?" Hiccup pried, desperate to know whether Spitaloot spilled the beans on Thorald's misgivings. But Stoic's expression didn't change and his vacant gaze told him all he needed to before his father even spoke. "No, nothing. He refused to, even when I asked." Stoic sighed, "Perhaps you could talk to him for me. Maybe you could get him to sing like a canary as it were. He might be more willing to talk to you knowing that you don't have a place on the board yet." Stoic suggested as a sign of hope was heard in his voice, and his eyes brightened up at the idea. Hiccup couldn't let his father down, not when he was on the verge of losing everything, so he nodded his head gingerly. Okay, father. I will talk to him. Hiccup slowly stood from his chair. I will find out who is behind this, alone. It is best if you stay out of this so that they don't catch wind. If I take the fall, perhaps there is still a chance that you can reclaim your position. Hiccup leaned over the desk and smiled at his father, tapping his father's hand slightly in comfort. I'm always on your side, Dad. No matter what. The door to Stoic's office closed with a sudden and final thud, the hollow noise reaching Stoic immediately and crushing his heart. The sound left a heavy weight on his shoulders, and his heart was not eased by his son's words. He was still worried. Despite his son's obvious ability and genius, Stoic still worried and was not warmed nor comforted by Hiccup's heroism. I sure hope you know what you're doing, son. For both of our sakes. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Hiccup waited patiently in his office, twisting and turning his office chair on its pivot. His mind was loud with constant thoughts, an eruption of questions and doubts whirring away inside. The office was quiet, and Hiccup could only hear the low ticks of his office clock that sat on the edge of his desk. The seconds seemed to pass slower with every sound, the noise echoing in Hiccup's ears like white noise. Spitaloot had agreed to meet with Hiccup that same day that he had spoken with his father. Hiccup had known Spitaloot before he was promoted and assigned to the board, his position in the company having started very low. However, Hiccup had grown to like the man, and the man himself treated Hiccup like a nephew. They knew each other very well, and Hiccup knew he could rely on the man to assist him in uncovering the truth of Thorald's schemes. A low knock sounded from Hiccup's door, the sound vibrating through the room and spooking Hiccup out of his nervous trance. Steadying his chair and straightening his jacket, Hiccup adjusted his seat on his chair and looked towards the door. Come in. Hiccup called out, his voice carrying confidently across his office. The door obligingly opened and revealed the wizened and kind face of Spitaloot, and he grinned at Hiccup as though he was meeting an old friend. Hiccup. Spitaloot greeted heartily, smiling broadly towards the young man behind his desk. My, you've got quite the office, haven't you? Spitaloot complimented as he took an appraising glance around the room. Hiccup nodded with a wry smile. And so have you now, right? Hiccup gestured to the seat in front of his desk and offered Spitaloot a seat. Taking up the offer, Spitaloot sat in front of Hiccup's desk and smiled at the young man with a kind smile. Oh, I can't complain. I guess it's nice to have an office of my own now. He shrugged. Hiccup nodded sagely and avoided his gaze, nervous and hesitant about what he was going to ask. But I don't think you call me here to talk about my office. Hiccup shook his head. So, what's this meeting really about then? Come on, spit it out. You see, Spitaloot. Hiccup sighed, fiddling with his fingers in his lap. But the anxiety wouldn't dissipate. It's about my father. You know that someone is trying to have him removed from the board, and don't try and lie to me. I know. Hiccup looked over at Spitaloot with a piercing stare, his gaze warning the man of his power. And I also know that this man has convinced you to go against my father. I merely wish to know who it is, and why they are doing this. You must know something. If not, how did he persuade you? Hiccup's words hung heavy in the air, a moment of silence passing between them before someone spoke again. It cannot leave this room, understand? Spitaloot's words were hushed and worried, as though he were a spy trying to mask their voice. His eyes darted around the room, clearly searching for hidden cameras or microphones that could be being used to tap into Hiccup's office. Of course. Hiccup nodded, leaning forward to lean onto his desk. His weight balanced on the flat surface and eager ears listened out for Spitaloot's story. Thorald is a dangerous man. I know you already had a suspicion of who it was. After all, you are married to his daughter and secretary. You were bound to hear something. Spitaloot looked about him again, still not sure whether there were ears and eyes in the walls. He uses your past against you, the kind of past that you'd much rather keep secret. He blackmails you. Spitaloot nodded. A few years ago I had a little misunderstanding with a young high school girl and I was given a restraining order. Thorald is using that against me. He says that if I don't help him get Stoic voted out, he will send proof of my criminal record to HR and the board committee to have me removed instead. He will ruin my life. Spitalut pleaded, the art of speech becoming a difficulty to him as his heart ached at the thought of the possible future. Do you know why he is doing this? Hiccup raised an eyebrow, willing to forget Spitalut's previous misdeeds. No. He refused to tell me when I asked. I tried to pry it out of him, but his mouth was tightly shut. Spitalut shook his head in defeat. Hiccup let out a short, sad sigh and lightly shook his head. How many board members do you think he needs to complete his support? I don't know, I can't be sure. There may be 5 or 6, but it's impossible to know what's going on inside that brain of his. Spitalut whispered, his head still lowered and shaking solemnly as the thoughts overwhelmed him. Don't worry, my friend. Spitalut looked up towards Hiccup hopefully. I am going to make sure that Thorold cannot remove my father and me before I take over this company. I cannot allow such a corrupt man to take over my father's legacy in the name of my mother. Hiccup spoke confidently. For a short, fleeting moment, Spitalut felt a sense of hope fill the air as the sight of the young man standing so confidently caused his lips to twitch into a wry smile. Chapter 32, Chapter 31. Chapter text. It had been a month since Hiccup had met with Spitalut, and the stress was beginning to get to him. Every night since then, he had been coming home late, never leaving the office before 1, or sometimes 2, in the morning. It had become an uphill struggle for Hiccup, and he was starting to realize how clever his adversary truly was. It's already 2 a.m., where is he? Astrid wondered to herself as she waited on the couch, her eyes and ears focused on the front door. She was sat in the living room with the door wide open, and from her perch, on the sofa, she had a clear view of the front door. Ever since he had started coming home late and she was having to go home by herself, Astrid had begun to wait for him to come home. Sometimes he'd notice her waiting for him and declare that she shouldn't wait and just go to bed. But there she was at 2 a.m., continuing to wait for Hiccup to come home. As she sat there, waiting for Hiccup to come home safe and sound, Astrid decided that she was going to talk to him. His silence had gone on long enough and Astrid needed answers to his weird behavior. His refusal to take her home and continuous late nights must be because of something. Astrid needed to know. She wanted to help. Come on. She muttered impatiently, her legs starting to shiver nervously as she sat on the sofa with her hands in her lap. Where are you? A sense of worry and fear had sewn itself into her voice as she muttered to herself, but she continued to deny that she was scared about anything. Suddenly, a rattle of keys in the door awoke Astrid from her worried trance and her gaze returned to the door. She stared at the moving object, its hinges slowly opening the door and revealing the inside of the home. Hiccup appeared from behind the door and made his way inside, sighing heavily to himself and with a tired expression plastered upon his face. Thank Thor, Astrid muttered to herself as she watched the door slowly creak open. Astrid sprung up from the sofa and strode into the hallway, standing in the way of Hiccup and blocking his path. Hiccup came to a halt, looking down at Astrid with a curious and confused face, his tired eyes scanning Astrid's figure as her hands came to rest on her hips. Astrid. He called out, not sure whether his sleep deprivation was getting to him already. I told you to stop waiting for me to come home, didn't I? You should get some sleep. How can I get to sleep when I keep worrying when you're coming? Sometimes, I fear that you're not coming home at all. How can I sleep in this condition? Astrid argued back, frustrated by Hiccup's ignorance of the situation. Astrid, don't be like this. Come on, let's go to bed. Not until you tell me what's going on with you, Astrid announced harshly, her words confident as her feet remained rooted to the spot. Her gaze pierced through Hiccup as she blocked his path. Hiccup tilted his head slightly, confused by her words, and a sense of tiredness swept over him like a tsunami. What do you mean? What are you talking about? Oh, come on, Hiccup. Did you really think that I'd believe this whole late-night deal was because you were taking your work at the company more seriously? I know something is wrong, and you are refusing to tell me. So, tell me. Astrid took a small step forward confidently, a demanding gesture towards Hiccup as she continued to glare daggers at the man in front of her. Despite Hiccup being a few inches taller than Astrid, Her stature and pose always managed to strike fear into Hiccup's heart, and he couldn't help but cower away from her. Her sense of ferocity was stronger than his own, and now that he was standing before it, he was more afraid of it than ever. "Tell me, Hiccup." Her voice was softer as she tried to appeal to Hiccup on another level. If anger only upset him, maybe kindness would open him up. "I want to help. I'm sorry." Hiccup whispered, his words sad and apologetic. His voice caused Astrid's strong and powerful presence to diminish in front of him, her figure crumbling beneath him as her heart became heavy from his words. "Why? What happened?" she breathed, barely able to speak as she saw a small tear build up in Hiccup's eye. She reached up tenderly and wiped it away before it could begin its journey down his face. "I lied to you, about your father," he began solemnly. "I told you that we would work together to uncover his secrets, to take him down together. But for the last few weeks, I've been doing this on my own, investigating his antics without you." He sighed, lowering his head. "What? But we agreed." "I know what we agreed, but I just couldn't risk it. If Thorold catches on to what we're doing, I don't know whether I can protect you against him." Hiccup shook his head, unable to think straight with the thoughts running through his head. "You don't need to protect me, Hiccup. I can take care of myself," Astrid replied, offering a sense of comfort to the fretting Hiccup. But it didn't help much. "I know you probably can. But I still wanted to leave you out of this, just until I was sure there was a way we could get him. I just didn't want you to get hurt." "What were you thinking? You told me that we'd do it together." "I want to help Hiccup, but I can't do that if you don't let me help you," Astrid complained, giving Hiccup a light punch in the shoulder, causing him to rub the area with his hand in embarrassment. I know that now." He sighed again. "I thought that it would be dangerous to ask for your help, you are his daughter and secretary after all. But I've found myself at a dead end, and I don't know what to do." He shook his head solemnly. "So, will you help me?" He raised his head slowly, looking into Astrid's eyes with a hopeful look. His eyes bore into Astrid's, his warm stare melting Astrid's cold gaze as she felt the sincerity in his voice. He wanted her help, he needed her help. Letting out a small sigh, she reluctantly tore her gaze away from Hiccup and lowered her head to stare at the ground defeatedly. "Damn, you're too cute," she muttered to herself, barely audible to the begging, broken man before her. "I'm, what?" Hiccup furrowed his brow, unsure whether he had heard Astrid correctly. "Annoying," Astrid replied, crossing her arms over her chest as she rolled her eyes at Hiccup's sorry look before her. "Well, will this change your mind?" Hiccup asked as he revealed a large brown bag. The logo printed on the side of the bag made Astrid's stomach growl and her eyes brighten up. "You brought takeout?" she asked excitedly, her heart racing and warming at the gesture as he held it out towards her. Hiccup nodded nervously, unsure whether he had made the right call, but the smile on Astrid's face was enough to prove him otherwise. "Well, yeah." He scratched the back of his neck with the other hand, his briefcase still in his hold. "I thought you'd still be up waiting for me, and I thought you might forgive me for making you worry if I brought you food." Hiccup smiled lightly at the solution that his brain had leapt to, apologizing to his wife. Astrid smiled and took the bag out of Hiccup's grasp and opened it up, taking in a large inhale of the beautiful aroma from within. Smells delicious," she exclaimed before looking behind her into the living room and then back over to Hiccup with a smile. "But, you know, I don't exactly have the biggest stomach in the world. How about you help me eat it while we watch a movie? You can tell me what you need my help with," Astrid suggested with a smile, gesturing over her shoulder into the living room. Hiccup smiled, knowing that Astrid had the potential to eat all of the things he had bought but just wanted him to stay with her. He wasn't about to pass up that opportunity. So, he nodded his head energetically and followed Astrid into the living room, throwing his briefcase next to the door in the hallway. "So, tell me what happened a few weeks ago. What made you start working late and stressing yourself out?" Astrid asked as she made herself comfortable on the sofa, laying the bag of takeaway food on the table. Hiccup smiled with a sad sigh, knowing that this question was inevitable but a part of him had hoped it would never crop up. However, whilst Astrid was making herself comfortable, Hiccup had wandered over to a large basket hidden in the far corner of the room, mostly hidden by shadow. Inside, he found a vast array of blankets, all of varying sizes, quality, thickness and weight. Hiccup grabbed a few before wandering back over to Astrid, the blankets tucked neatly under his arm. Well, Hiccup started, finally taking a seat beside Astrid on the sofa. I went to see my father in his office. He had recently had one of his supporters turn on him and declare that he would be voting against him in the next vote of confidence. Hiccup started explaining whilst Astrid set out the takeout on the low coffee table in front of them. After a few minutes, Hiccup had brought Astrid up to speed on his discoveries. He knew that most of the men supporting Thorold were being blackmailed and the others had been paid an extortionate amount of money to keep their mouths shut and vote on his side. Hiccup had been trying to track down the evidence to uncover this fraud. But he had found nothing. "There's nothing?" Astrid asked, finally speaking for the first time since Hiccup had started explaining what had been happening. "No, not one single piece of evidence to prove that Thorold is paying people off and blackmailing them." Hiccup sighed, shaking his head lightly. "I know that the evidence is there, but it will be in Thorold's possession. It's an uphill battle for us." Hiccup picked up a small dumpling from one of the many trays of takeout food that Astrid had laid out on the table. Astrid watched him take a bite and smiled at his ruminative expression as he chewed on the bite of the dumpling. His brow furrowed slightly as his mind worked mysteriously, his gaze staying pointedly ahead of him. She wouldn't admit it aloud or in her head, but he looked rather attractive like that. "I want to know where he's been getting his money. Goodness knows we were never a rich family. I mean, a few years ago, before my father joined your company, we were bankrupt." Astrid revealed, her voice curious and questioning. Her mind recollected her father's spending and behavior with money, and he had never been a safe man with money. "Wait." Hiccup slowly lowered his fork and gently placed it down on the table, the dumpling now nestled back in the tray. "Your family went bankrupt?" Hiccup asked, his interest piqued and his mind reeling at the new information. "Yeah, I thought you knew, or maybe someone told you. My father used to own a company before he came to work for your father's company. It went bankrupt after he made a pretty stupid investment and lost all his profits." Astrid explained nonchalantly, shrugging her shoulders lightly as though the memory was not a hard thing to admit. "Maybe it's the late nights, maybe I never knew. But that just gave me an idea." Hiccup grabbed his phone and started searching through the internet, his eyes glued to the screen. Astrid rolled her eyes as she watched Hiccup trip down the spiral of obsession, a sense of desperation to his actions as he furiously typed away on his phone. It was clear to Astrid that Hiccup's idea was most likely to be a wild and audacious one, and one with the least amount of sense given his current state. So, with a heavy sigh, Astrid leapt over onto Hiccup and snatched his phone out of his hands and pulled it as far away from him as she possibly could, given their height difference. "Hey! Astrid! Give that back!" Hiccup yelled out desperately, his arms flailing about wildly as he attempted to retrieve his phone from Astrid's grip. Unsuccessfully. "Hiccup, stop it!" Astrid held up a hand and pushed it against Hiccup's chest, gently pushing him away from her and still holding the phone up out of his reach. "You are sleep deprived. You are tired. You are hungry. You are obsessed. Calm down and take a rest. You can't help your father when you can barely look after yourself." Hiccup slowly started to stop resisting Astrid's weight and gently sat back on the sofa. "You asked me to help, and this is my first act. Eat something with me and get some rest. Please." Her pleading causes Hiccup to let out a small sigh and lower his head in defeat. "You're right." Hiccup leaned back into the back of the sofa. "I'm not thinking straight, and I've been going around in circles the past few days. Maybe I do need a rest. Come on, there's all this food here that you brought home. Now let's get eating." Astrid cheered before continuing to dig into the delicious food. A few hours had passed and Hiccup was struggling to keep his eyes open. His head was growing heavy and it seemed as though the space between his imagination and reality were starting to merge. Hiccup felt as though he was sleeping even though he was awake. Soon, his body could take no more and he slumped down carefully, his head slowly dropping down and landing in Astrid's lap. Alarmed, Astrid jumped in her seat but didn't move. shocked by the head that had so gently landed on her lap. She smiled at the familiar auburn hair and couldn't stop herself from casually brushing her hands through the soft brown strands. Her fingers grazed through the strands of hair, their soft touch and smooth texture relaxing Astrid as she continued the motions. Hiccup moaned at her touch, his deep sleep not deep enough to ignore the majestic feeling of Astrid's fingers through his hair. Astrid chuckled at the noise, the sound sending a hot flush to speed through her skin and settling in her stomach. But her actions never stopped. Her repetitive motions soon sent her brain into a deeply relaxed state, and soon she found herself slowly drifting off to sleep. Chapter 33, Chapter 32. Chapter text. Hiccup awoke the next day, still lying on the couch in the living room and a slight crick in his back from the uncomfortable cushions. Groaning lightly, Hiccup rose gently and looked about him, searching for Astrid and any remnants of their meal last night. However, it was all clean. "Morning, Hiccup." A beautiful, serene voice called out to him at that moment, waking him up from any drowsy feeling he was having. Turning around, he saw Astrid coming through the door into the living room with 2 mugs of steaming coffee within. It was a sight Hiccup could get used to seeing every morning. But only in his dreams. Passing a mug over to Hiccup, Astrid sat beside him on the couch, getting comfortable on the cushions that had become misshapen due to Hiccup's weight. With a smile, she scanned his figure and let out a small chuckle as she reached up and fixed a few loose strands of hair that were messing up his auburn locks. "If you were hoping to go to work looking like this, you are very wrong," Astrid commented with a chuckle, smiling brightly as she brushed her hand through his hair again. Hiccup quickly reached his hand up to his head and grabbed her hand, stopping her actions. "Stop it, you're breaking one of the boundaries," Hiccup pointed out reluctantly, his mind wanting her to stop before his heart exploded from the welcome action. He couldn't admit it to her, but her soothing fingers that ran through his hair made his heart beat and his body grow hot. He loved the feeling. But it was making him fall in love with her, so he had to stop it. "You're right." "Sorry," Astrid replied lowly, a sense of disappointment and regret filling her voice as she retreated her hand and placed it on the side of her mug, cupping the object between both hands. "Anyway," Astrid cleared her throat, "I think you should have a shower and change your clothes before we head off. I'll drive us and you can get a few more winks in before we get there." Astrid suggested. A smile of excitement and secrecy plastered itself across her face as she slowly stood up from the couch and made her way out of the room. "Wait!" Hiccup called out, trying to crawl over to her without spilling his coffee, but resorting instead to just turning towards her. "Why are you driving? Can you even drive?" Hiccup asked, unaware that Astrid found one of his questions quite offensive. "I'm not bad at everything, Hiccup. Besides, do you think I'm that irresponsible enough to not know how to drive?" Astrid asked, placing a hand over her chest as she let out a short gasp at his words. Hiccup shook his head, a mild look of worry crossing over his eyes as he heard her words. No. That's not what I meant. Look." Astrid held up her hand and immediately stopped Hiccup's words. "I'm driving us to work because I'm insisting. Okay. Let's just leave it at that and stop arguing." Astrid turned on her heel and walked out of the room, leaving Hiccup with an open mouth and a tongue filled with words he was wanting to say. However, as she left the room, all the words died upon Hiccup's tongue and he was left in the room to begin his morning routine. Astrid left him to clean himself up and get ready for the workday, making her way to her room to get herself ready for work. She dressed up in her usual work attire, but as she began buttoning up her shirt she noticed a small duffel bag shoved to the corner, in the shadows. An idea popped into her head and made her smile at the thoughts, although she knew that Hiccup wouldn't go along with it willingly. She decided to risk it and took the duffel bag into her hands and placed inside it a couple of casual clothes for her to wear. Whilst Hiccup was in the shower and he was completely unaware of her presence in his room, she wandered in quietly, took a few clothes of his own and shoved them into the bag hurriedly. He wouldn't willingly agree to her plan, so she was just going to have to kidnap him. She was lucky she had already managed to convince him to let her drive. An hour or so had passed since Astrid had wandered into the living room and woken Hiccup up from his peaceful sleep. Now, she was sat in the car on the drive waiting for Hiccup to finish getting ready for the day and lock up the house. As she sat in the car, her eyes admired the sleek, smooth interior of the car that she hadn't paid much attention to before. The car itself was a black sedan, four-wheel drive type car, with a 6-gearbox in the central console. Astrid herself loved manual cars. The feel of changing gears always filled her with a sense of power and speed that an automatic car could never replicate. Whenever she changed gears, she felt as though she was in a Fast and Furious movie, and Vin Diesel was in the car seat next to her telling her where to go. Her hands smoothed over the wheel, feeling the slick, leather material that made up the hard structure of the wheel. The rough stitching that lined it disturbed the smooth feeling beneath her fingers, but she loved the feeling of it nonetheless. Astrid's eyes darted back up to look in the rear-view mirror of the car, her peripheral vision having spotted the movement from the front door of their house. As she looked in the mirror, Astrid set her eyes on the figure of Hiccup making his way down the steps, his tie loose and his briefcase lazily swinging about in his hands. It was almost obvious that his hair was still wet and he had not buttoned up his shirt correctly as he rushed over to the car, and the image made Astrid chuckle. Diving into the car, Hiccup plopped himself into the passenger seat beside Astrid, throwing his briefcase in the back seat and collapsing fully into the leather seats of the car. Astrid smiled at the sight of the exhausted Hiccup as he slumped into the seat, not putting up his seatbelt as he let out a huge sigh. "Let's go then, we're already running late," Hiccup said exhaustedly, his voice monotone and tired as he let out another sigh, his eyes drooping slightly. Astrid smiled and leaned forward onto the wheel, getting a better view of him as she did so. "What?" he asked, aware of her actions and her gaze making him a little nervous. "I'm not going anywhere until you do up your seatbelt. Unless you want me to do it for you," she asked suggestively, giving Hiccup a small wink. Hiccup felt his heart jump at her action and quickly fumbled around for his seatbelt, unwilling to have her cross that boundary after what he had told her that morning. "Okay," Hiccup announced as the seatbelt clicked into his holding. Looking up to Astrid with a confident nod and wry smile, their eyes met. "I'm ready." Astrid nodded and turned the key to the engine. Listening to the car roar into life, Astrid put it into gear and drove away, hearing the gravel crunch beneath the tires as they crawled out of the drive and onto the roads. The ride was smooth, and Astrid made no sudden turns or heinous getaways as she drove carefully along the roads. Her smooth driving was enough to lull Hiccup back to sleep and allow him to start snoring softly, his nasal breaths not going unnoticed by Astrid, who found them cute and funny. Giggling to herself quietly, Astrid turned down a new road and began heading in a new direction, unbeknownst to Hiccup, and made her way on a long journey to a new place far away from work. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Hiccup's eyes fluttered open, the bright sunlight blinding him as he squirmed in his seat. As his eyes opened and the picture behind them started to focus, Hiccup felt his heart drop and stomach lurch. He could see an open road and a far-stretching ocean to the side of him, the water tipping over the horizon farther than the eye could see. The sight was beautiful. "What the hell is going on? Where are we?" Hiccup yelled sleepily, his sleep still trying to work its way out of his system as he began to fully wake up from his relaxing slumber. Astrid was eating a small granola bar in one hand whilst the other rested upon the wheel, coolly cruising along the empty open road by the sea. She turned her head as she heard Hiccup stir and heard his bellowing voice call out in shock and anger as he realized where he was. Rolling her eyes, she gestured to the open ocean beside them and the beautiful sky above them. "Where do you think you are?" "We're going on a day out by the sea. I've always wanted to have one, and I thought that you probably needed one," Astrid announced happily, a bright smile on her face as she turned another corner in the road as it wound its way along the cliffside that ran along the shore of the beach. "But Astrid, we're missing work," Hiccup complained, a hint of worry and panic in his voice as he adjusted his seat and properly sat up in the chair. "Relax Hiccup, we'll be fine. Look, we're only a 10-minute drive away from our destination. Just relax." Astrid tried to calm him down, but Hiccup was annoyed and irritated. Astrid had lured him in and kidnapped him. It seemed like there was another person that he could trust who had used that against him and lied to him. "No, Astrid. We're going back." Hiccup leaned over and tried to grab the wheel to turn the car around. Astrid panicked, shocked by his actions, and reached out an arm to stop him. Pushing his arm away, she successfully stopped him from yanking on the wheel and pulling the car out of control on this open road. Although there were no cars around, Astrid still felt that they would crash or hit something on the road if Hiccup continued to try and grab the wheel. Hiccup! Stop it! Are you trying to kill us? Astrid yelled out, pushing Hiccup away from the wheel as he attempted to lunge towards her again. Astrid! We have to go back! Hiccup yelled and lunged towards the wheel again. Astrid saw him coming, but her reaction was too late. Hiccup's hands gripped tightly onto the wheel and lurched the car to the side, harshly steering the car off of the road as his action could barely pull the wheel into a full rotation. The car swerved off the road and into the barrier that separated the road from the beach. Luckily, as soon as Hiccup had grabbed onto the wheel, Astrid had started to slam on the brakes, pushing both pedals down with full force. However, the damage was already done and the car had already slammed through the barrier and made it onto the sand, barreling through the rough material and collapsing into a ditch of soft sand. The car had stopped and wasn't about to move anywhere. They were stuck. Hiccup, what in Thor's name did you think you were doing? Astrid yelled in anger after the shock of the crash had washed over her and the car had finally come to a stop. Were you trying to kill us? Her heart was still racing in her chest as she surveyed the land around her. There was no way they were going to be able to get the car out by themselves. Hiccup let go of the wheel, his body still slung over the central console as he had grabbed onto the wheel, and his breath had been fully knocked out of him from the sudden stop in the ditch. The airbags of the car hadn't gone off as the car had slowed before he came to a sudden stop, but Hiccup felt as though he'd been punched by something soft after they had stopped. Looking up, Hiccup saw Astrid staring at him with daggers in her eyes, but a small look of worry was hidden behind the fury. She had given him another punch in the arm as he had slowly started to sit back up and haul himself off the central console. His brain hadn't kicked into gear yet and he still wasn't fully aware of what had just happened, nor whether it was real. Are you okay? Hiccup asked, letting out a pained sigh as he finally sat back in his seat. He held his side, a dull ache throbbing there as he collapsed into his seat beside Astrid, his head lolling back to rest on the headrest behind him. Yes, I'm fine. No thanks to you. She scoffed before her eyes noticed the pained breaths and cringing face that Hiccup was making, his hand glued to his side as his head rested against the headrest of his chair. Hiccup. Are you okay? Astrid asked worriedly, swiftly undoing her belt and leaning over to him, checking him over for any flesh wounds. Hiccup groaned again, the dull ache of pain finally beginning to subside slightly and dull into a more bearable pain. He looked up to see Astrid worrying over him like a concerned mother, her hands not knowing where they needed to be and her eyes searching every inch of him for a sigh of discomfort. Hiccup reached out and grabbed her hand, stopping her worried actions and causing her eyes to meet with Hiccup's, and he smiled. I'm fine. Just a bruise I think. I can manage. Hiccup replied, a reassuring smile on his face as he met eyes with Astrid who still held a look of concern and worry. Smiling back lightly, Astrid nodded and leaned back into her chair before opening her door and stepping out onto the soft, loose sand of the beach where they had crashed. Putting her hands on her hips, she looked about her in search of any help or passing cars. But nothing. Barely anyone used this road to get to the beach, instead deciding to use the main highway and go to the much denser and more touristy beach further down from them. However, Astrid liked the quieter beaches in Berk. These beaches never had any tourists, possibly a few locals, and always seemed deserted. It was a perfect place to stop and think in peace, with no sounds of the city to drown out the quiet, serene silence of nature and the crashing waves of the sea. Well, that's just great, Astrid muttered to herself, her hands on her hips. No cars, and most likely, no phone reception. She sighed heavily, grabbing her phone out of her pocket and looking in the corner of her phone screen. Yep, no signal. Thanks, Hiccup. Hey now. This wasn't all my fault. Hiccup argued, finally escaping from the crashed and unusable car. He trudged his way over to Astrid with a stern and serious face, back to the mood he was in when he crashed the car. If you hadn't decided to take us to the beach, we wouldn't be in this mess. Well, if you had decided to ask for my help sooner, we wouldn't be in this mess either. Astrid argued back, momentarily stunning Hiccup. Hiccup, I did this for you. Coming to the beach. That was for you. I wanted you to come here and relax, to forget about my father and everything that is going on at work. I want to get back the guy that you were when I married you. He was nice and friendly and fun to be around. I hate having to wait for you to come home until 3 a.m. every night. I hate that I have no idea about what's going on inside that big brain of yours. I hate that you try to avoid me because of this whole issue because you're scared of what might happen to me. I hate that you love your work more than anything, more than me. Astrid shut up after that, not fully realizing what she had just said until a few seconds later when the silence fell between them. Her words hung in the air, and neither one of them knew what to do with them. Do they ignore it? Take it differently? Forget about it? Hiccup wasn't sure and took a small step towards Astrid, her angry expression faltering slightly from her previous words and accidental slip of the tongue. You're right. I'm sorry. Hiccup apologized, lowering his head in shame as her words made his heart hurt. He had no idea what his actions were doing to her. I'm sorry I made you worry so much about me, but why couldn't you have just told me that this is what you were doing? Would you have come along? Would you have agreed to it so willingly? She asked, knowing that Hiccup wasn't thinking properly just yet. Hiccup cast his mind back and let out a gentle nod in recognition. No, you're probably right. I might not have done. Hiccup agreed with a sad sigh. But I'm here now. So what do we do? He asked plainly, tilting his head innocently as he looked at Astrid for an answer. Now, we walk into town. Astrid pointed behind her, her finger gesturing to the small cluster of buildings far in the distance behind them. The sun lit up the small town like a beacon and Astrid let out a small sigh. This journey would have taken 10 minutes by car, I don't know how long it will take on foot. On the sand. So let's get moving. Chapter 34, Chapter 33. Chapter text. Having both privately gotten changed out of their work attire in the car, Astrid especially wanting to get out of her tight skirt and into her baggy, comfortable jeans, the couple began their trek along the beach. Astrid had stormed off ahead of Hiccup, annoyed by his previous actions and for crashing the car into the beach. All she wanted to do was make this day a relaxing and soothing time for them both, what with Hiccup coming home late every night. But Hiccup had to just ruin it all. Astrid, come on. I said I was sorry. Hiccup called out to her for the 10th time as they walked along the beach. His constant apologies had started to irritate Astrid as he tried to catch up to her, but every time he got close she would speed up. Sorry doesn't UN crash the car, Hiccup. Astrid replied sarcastically, her voice carried by the wind as she trudged angrily through the sand. Astrid, please. Hiccup whined, his nasal voice closer than before. Astrid turned around quickly and came face to face with Hiccup, his head looming a few inches over her own as she stood before him, not making eye contact. Her gaze fixed upon his chest for a few beats, a tense and uncomfortable silence settling between the two of them. Finally looking up to meet his eyes, Astrid let out a soft sigh. Hiccup tilted his head curiously, trying to gauge Astrid's emotions and work out whether she was still angry at him or willing to accept his apology. Hiccup, just stop it. I know you want to feel better and that's why you're apologizing, but I wanted to make this day a relaxing and easy day for the both of us. Now, look at us. Astrid gestures to the two of them before looking out around her at the beach and the rising waves of the ocean. We're where you wanted us to be though, right? Hiccup asked hesitantly, trying to see the silver lining in a fairly obvious failed plan. Astrid shot him an unimpressed look and made him regret offering that excuse. I'll shut up. Don't you dare try and spin this your way. It's because of you that we're in this mess. Astrid told him seriously, pointing a stern finger his way as she spoke before turning away and continuing her way up the beach. Astrid. Hiccup called out calmly, a sense of sadness in his voice as he spoke. Astrid turned around to face him, but he had stopped in his tracks and Astrid had to walk back towards him to be able to hear his soft words. Her brow furrowed and her head tilted slightly, a hint of concern behind her eyes as she watched him stand with his head lowered and his hands tucked into his jean pockets. I was scared. He admitted sadly, letting out a heavy sigh as his shoulders slumped with the large exhale. No. I am scared of everything. When I found out that you'd tricked me and taken me to the beach, I panicked. Astrid took a small step closer, Hiccup's gaze still focused on the ground. I was afraid that another person I had come to trust had betrayed me. Perhaps you were working for your father and taking me out here to get rid of me. Hiccup suggested with a small chuckle in his voice, knowing how absurd the idea was. But Astrid understood. So many people around Hiccup and his father, so many that they trusted, were falling away from them. They were losing so many of their friends and advisors to her father. She didn't even realize that Hiccup had a small doubt that she was truly on his side. But she didn't hate him for it, in fact, she agreed. No one could be sure of whose side Astrid was on. Hiccup. Astrid called out, earning a glance from Hiccup in her direction. I'm on my own side. Sometimes trusting someone is what makes a great relationship. I trust you, can you trust me? Astrid asked, holding out a hand to him to pull him along the beach towards the town with her. Hiccup's eyes focused on her outstretched hand. He paused, unsure whether to take it and trust her. But the way she seems to trust him, and care for him, and follow him. It would be inconsiderate to say he didn't care either, and it would be a lie to say he didn't trust her at all. She was right. He had to take the leap. Grabbing onto Astrid's hand, Hiccup smiled at Astrid with a warm, friendly smile. Giving her a short, confident nod, they continued to walk down the beach holding hands. It only lasted a few minutes, but Hiccup enjoyed the feeling of Astrid's hand in his, the gentle grip they had on each other's slightly sweaty palms as they trudged through the soft sand beneath their feet. You know you can let go of my hand now, right? Astrid finally perked up, glancing down at their intertwined hands in between them. Hiccup looked down at them before hastily ripping his hand away from hers in shock realization, slightly embarrassed that he had held onto her hand for such a long time. I'm sorry, Hiccup apologized, rubbing the back of his neck nervously as his face blushed from embarrassment. But Astrid just let out a small chuckle. It's okay, it happens. She shrugged and continued walking along the beach beside Hiccup, whose blushing cheeks eventually faded away. They walked the next few minutes in silence, only the sound of the crunching sand beneath their feet and the crashing waves filling the air. Hiccup occasionally looked up towards Astrid with a curious eye, searching for something on her face but never finding it. He didn't speak but had 1,000 questions burning on the tip of his tongue, just waiting for one to be let free. How did you come to know about this place? Hiccup asked after minutes of silence. Astrid turned her gaze over towards him and tilted her head curiously. Why do you ask? To fill the silence. Hiccup shrugged. Astrid smiled and breathed a small chuckle at his words. It would be better to talk than continue to walk in silence as the town feels further away. And because I was curious. Okay, I found this town a few years ago. I found it on one of my vacation days. Astrid began, Hiccup occasionally stealing glances her way as they continued to walk along the beach. I had wanted to get away from the city, instead of spending my day inside and watching TV. No, I wanted to go out and relax, find somewhere idyllic and let loose. People usually go to bars and get drunk to let loose, but I don't particularly do that. I'm more of a quiet, isolated place kind of person. Astrid explained, looking around her as she spoke. Hiccup nodded in understanding and smiled at her energetic words, happy to talk about herself more than something serious. You like to be left alone? Hiccup interjected, causing Astrid to steal a glance his way with a small nod. Yeah, I guess you could say that. Astrid shrugged, almost nodding in agreement as they continued to walk through the soft sand. Anyway, I was driving along these twisty, isolated little roads, when I found myself driving along here. She pointed to the stretch of road running alongside the beach, the same road that they had just crashed off of. She smiled at the memory of her first encounter with this road and its beach. It was so quiet and peaceful, I remember opening the window and hearing the breeze and smelling the salty sea air. It was magical. It was like I had found a little piece of paradise all by myself. That was until I found the cove. Astrid pointed to the town ahead, the sun's light starting to dim and cloud over. Hiccup followed her finger and looked toward the town. You mean, the town? No, I mean the cliffside. Yes, of course, I mean the town. Astrid sarcastically replied, rolling her eyes gently at Hiccup's dumb question. Hiccup smiled at her exhaustive speech, her eyes rolling at the obvious question that made him chuckle. The town is called the Cove? He asked curiously, his eyes now focused on the town that was clear in their sight. They couldn't have been more than a few minutes' walk away from it at that point, but it still seemed very far away. "Yeah, it's beautiful, isn't it?" she asked excitedly, her voice slightly dreamy from the memory and the beautiful sight of the town before her. Hiccup nodded in agreement, transfixed by the sight of the town that lay ahead of them. "Yeah, it's almost fairy-like," he mused. "I know." Astrid shook her head, snapping herself out of her dreamlike trance. "Anyway, I found this place and spent the day there. There was a lovely little archery range near the cliffs in a very secluded area away from the rest of the town. There was a quiet bar in town that was always welcoming to new customers, and the people inside were just delightful. Everyone here seemed so warm and welcoming, never really wanting me to leave. But because I was only visiting, I had to leave." Astrid sighed sadly, lowering her head in disappointment as she thought back to the memory. "After I left that day, I always told myself that if I ever was having a rough time and needed to escape, I would come here. So, that's why you brought me?" Hiccup asked, but his voice seemed more like he was stating a fact rather than asking her whether that was truly the case. She nodded and stared pointedly ahead at the town. "I never thought I'd bring someone else here with me, but I knew that you needed to get away more than I did. You needed this place more than me," she admitted sadly, shaking her head in sadness and stupidity as she thought back to their moment in the car, and how upset Hiccup had seemed at being brought to this place. Had she made a bad decision? "You're right. I do need rest and an escape. I just didn't want to admit it." Hiccup spoke after a moment of silence had settled between the two of them. "Perhaps we can find a mechanic when we get into town and have fun while we wait for him to fix the car. You can show me around if you'd like." Hiccup suggested with a hopeful smile, shrugged his shoulders in a non-committal way, leaving the option open for Astrid. "Yeah, I think that would be nice," Astrid replied, a happy, warm smile stretching across her lips as she looked up to Hiccup. Both met eyes with one another and felt their hearts race a small amount within their chests. Something was stirring between them. However, their moment was broken by a heavy raindrop that landed on Hiccup's face. The drop dribbled down his cheeks slowly as Astrid's gaze looked up towards the sky. The clouds were darkening quite rapidly and another raindrop fell from the sky and landed square on Astrid's forehead. The rain started to trickle down on top of them and their gazes locked again. "We'd better hurry before this gets any worse," Hiccup announced and started to walk towards the town at a faster pace, his feet trudging through the sand quicker and heavier than before. Astrid followed in pursuit, keeping up with his fast pace as they made their way towards the town through the heavy, soft sand, the terrain not making their journey any easier or faster. The rain was gentle at first. It was bearable weather as they got closer and closer to the town, the promenade off of the beach edging ever closer to them. The hope that they could make it before the rainfall increased was glowing warmly in their minds. However, their hopes were soon shattered as the clouds darkened and the heavens opened above them. The rain collided with their bodies like little rocks and pelted into them harshly as they raced down the beach as fast as they could. Having reached the promenade, they were able to run on solid ground and were off of the irritating, coarse sand that made the journey much harder than it needed to be. "Come on, I think there's a shop down here that we can shelter in out of the rain," Astrid called out over the volume of the rain that surrounded them. The raindrops seemed to crash down around them like boulders and the sound of the rain around them only seemed to grow louder in the town. However, Astrid led them both to an idyllic, quiet part of the town where there was a small shop resting on the corner of the road. Pelting it across the road, the two burst into the store and dashed into the shelter, unaware of the bell that hung above the door that had clattered to life. As the door shut, and the two of them were able to get their breaths back, their eyes scanned their surroundings and looked at the things within the store. It was a small china shop, with a few antiquities and paintings littering the walls. Hiccup wandered further inside the store, having a look at the curious artifacts lining the shop shelves. Meanwhile, Astrid made her way over to the counter at the back of the store, a small but narrow staircase behind it, and tapped the bell that sat on the counter. No one was there, and they seemed to be the only two customers in the store. "Just a minute, sweetheart," a hearty, welcoming voice called out to Astrid from up the stairs in front of her, behind the counter. She tried to crane her neck to look up the stairs, but she was at the wrong angle and could only see the wall of the next floor. Soon, an elderly gentleman came bounding down the stairs, a man who felt as youthful as them but looked as old as Astrid's grandfather. Astrid remembered her first encounter with this unique elderly man when she had first arrived in town, having wandered her way into the store by accident. He was always a welcoming man and was always intrigued by the workings of the city, many of which Astrid was more than happy to hear from him. "Astrid. Is that you?" the man asked as he stood behind the counter before Astrid with a beaming smile. Hiccup raised an eyebrow and looked up over the shop shelves to look upon the scene at the counter. Yes it is. It's been a while, hasn't it?" She greeted him with a warm, friendly smile. Astrid had often visited the store whenever she had a vacation day, loving to talk to this old gentleman who felt more like a father to her than her own. "You on another vacation day?" he asked curiously, happy to see her here. But Astrid shrugged regretfully and cringed slightly by his words. "Well." She stretched out the word with a higher-pitched tone than usual. "Not exactly." It was at that moment that the old man met eyes with Hiccup, who was still watching them from behind one of the shop shelves. As their eyes met, he ducked beneath the shelf and continued to occupy himself with one of the many artifacts lining its space. The old man raised an eyebrow and tried to look over the shelf to get a better look at the young man, however, Hiccup had managed to hide out of his sight. "You there, young man?" the shop owner called out to Hiccup. Hiccup winced at the man's words, knowing he had been caught. Hiccup slowly rose from behind the shelf and revealed himself again to the old man. "What are you doing behind there? You looking to steal something?" Hiccup's eyes widened and his hands came up before him to shake away the idea defensively. However, Astrid beat him to it. "No. It's okay, Neil." Astrid calmed the shop owner, holding up her hand defensively to soothe his presumptive thoughts. "He's with me," Astrid replied vaguely, not revealing the true nature of their relationship to this kind of man. "Then why is he stood over there? Come over here, young man. I don't bite." He chuckled, gesturing Hiccup to come closer with a caring, soft smile that welcomed Hiccup in. Hiccup nodded shyly and made his way over to the counter and stood beside Astrid. He wasn't sure whether he was supposed to be there, and he felt a little out of place standing there in front of the counter beside the girl who was friends with this man. He almost felt as though he was meeting her father. "Neil, do you know whether there's a mechanic in town?" "You see, someone." She looked over to Hiccup with an accusatory gaze before looking back to the old man. "Crashed our car and we need it to be repaired and pulled off the beach. Do you know if they can help us?" she asked desperately, pleading to the man before her, but he slowly shook his head apologetically. "I really wish I could say yes, Miss Astrid. But unfortunately, the mechanic in town was called away to some business in the city, lucky thing, and he won't be here until tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" both Hiccup and Astrid asked at the same time in shock. For a moment their eyes met and their gaze turned back to the man behind the counter. "Yes, unfortunately, your car is going to have to stay on that beach until then. Perhaps you can find a room at the inn, maybe there will be someone in town welcome enough to put you up for the night. But I'm afraid there's not a lot I can do for you, Miss Astrid. You and your husband are going to have to stay the night here before your car can be fixed." Chapter 35, Chapter 34. Chapter Text. "Husband." Astrid muttered, Neil's words registering in her mind as they settled in her ears. The man perked up and nodded his head energetically in response, a bright smile on his face. "He is your husband, is he not? You're both wearing wedding rings after all, and you two do look like a beautiful couple." Neil complimented happily, a smile never wiping off his face as he looked between Hiccup and Astrid. "Oh, no, that's right." Astrid cut Hiccup off, smiling brightly at Neil whilst sending Hiccup a warning glance. It would be too complicated and confusing to explain their real situation. So, they would both just have to put up with having to pretend they are married whilst in the cove. Astrid wasn't happy about it but would deal with it anyway. She loved this town. Anyway, she began again, her gaze lowering to look at the wedding ring upon her finger that she continued to forget was ever there. She looked back up at the shop owner with a concerned look. "Where is the nearest inn? Or is there a hotel nearby?" she asked curiously, a look of concern and slight panic hidden behind her eyes. The man smiled again, brighter than before, and nodded. "Of course, there is an inn. However, as you all know, there are no hotels in town. We don't get that many tourists around here, miss. No, but there is an inn down the road. It's called the Burkian Warrior. It's just down yonder. If you continue to walk along this road out in front along the promenade you'll soon reach it. He explained enthusiastically, as though he was an NPC in a role-playing game, and directed the couple to the next location. But mind you don't go just yet, lass. It doesn't look much like the rain is going to let up soon. Why don't you stay a little till it calms down? Neil offered, causing a smile to light upon Astrid's face. Thank you, Neil. Thank you. Astrid took his hand in her own and shook it gratefully. A smile plastered across her features as she shook his hand. He smiled back and responded to her handshake with a gentle action. You're welcome, my love. I'm always willing to help such a beautiful and kind couple. Young man, he called at Hiccup, his eyes focused on Hiccup's figure and scanning him up and down like a disapproving father. What's your name? His question seemed forceful and intimidating, but in reality, it was an average curious question. Hiccup, sir. My name is Hiccup Haddock. Hiccup announced, introducing himself to Neil politely and thankfully. Neil smiled at Hiccup and graciously nodded his way. Nice to meet you, Hiccup. Neil greeted. You know, my nephew was called Hiccup. What a smart young lad he was. Served in the army, you know. Was a brave little lad, but unfortunately, a bit pig-headed at times. He chuckled, the thought of his young nephew coming to mind. Astrid chuckled along with him and leaned closer to him so that her voice was slightly away from Hiccup. Yeah, they are a bit, aren't they? She joked, earning another hearty chuckle from Neil. Oh, my. Yes, they are. His laughter died down as his gaze looked out the window to the streets outside. Well, would you look at that? The rain seems to have calmed down. You should be all right to go now. Just be sure to come back soon. He called to the couple as they made their way out of the store, waving their goodbyes to the friendly shop owner who still stood at the counter. After leaving the store, the rain having calmed and dissipated rather quickly, the couple walked along the promenade in search of the inn called the Burkian Warrior. Astrid hadn't heard of the inn before. In fact, she hadn't been sure there was even an inn in town. However, as her eyes scanned the buildings, they landed upon a sign of a warrior, barbarian type with a large axe with the words Burkian Warrior decorating the top and bottom of the sign, circling the character art. What a terrifying image. Hiccup commented as his eyes looked upon the character on the sign. This must be it. Astrid announced as she pointed to the sign, looking over to Hiccup to see him look back at her with a nod of agreement. He nodded and smiled back at her as he registered the words on the sign, both of them agreeing that this must be the place. Let's get inside then. Opening the door to the inn, they were welcomed by an alcoholic air that intoxicated anyone in the radius, its effect hitting both Hiccup and Astrid as soon as they entered. The smell was unlike any bar or hotel they had ever been in before. The wooden structures that decorated the ceilings and walls showed the building's age, despite Astrid having never heard of this place before on her countless visits to the town. Hiccup could taste the alcohol in the air, the woody beer smell affecting their senses as they wandered into the building in search of someone who could help them. Hello. An older woman, probably in her mid-50s to her early 60s, called out to the young couple who had just wandered into her establishment and were looking rather dazed and lost. She waved them over to get their attention and they happily wandered towards her with curious and worried eyes. Welcome to the Burkian Warrior. Can I get you something to drink? She asked automatically, clearly a line she had practiced and used fairly often with customers. Actually, Astrid started, causing the woman to look over at her with a curious and friendly smile. We were hoping that you could help us with something. You see, our car is out of service and the mechanic won't be here till tomorrow. So we need a place to stay. Do you maybe have a room for us? She asked hesitantly, unsure whether this was really an inn or just a bar. But Neil wouldn't have lied to her, would he? Of course, we can put you up for the night. The woman announced, a slight Irish accent showing through in her enthusiastic and excited voice. Her volume raised a few notches as she threw her arms open and a bright smile burst onto her face. We are always happy to help any young couples wanting to spend a night there. But you know, it's been such a long time since anyone's rented a room in our inn, that sometimes I forget we even are one. She turned around to look around the back of the bar area they were currently standing in. Hey, Henry. We still got one room left upstairs. She bellowed into the bar, her head constantly moving to look for her partner. Yeah, the key should be along the wall by the door. Henry called back, his voice diminished and far away as he shouted back to the woman who stood before Hiccup and Astrid. She smiled happily, grabbed the key from beside the door and turned back to Hiccup and Astrid with the key thrust out towards them. Here you go. Your room is just upstairs to your right. It should say guest 1 on the door. There's another room there, but it's currently occupied by another couple. The bathroom is at the end of the corridor, the door right in front of you as you turn right up the stairs. She explained, all whilst maintaining a bright smile. Astrid nodded and shyly smiled back and turned her head to look over at Hiccup to gesture him to follow. I thought you said you didn't get that many customers using the rooms. Hiccup asked, confused about this mysterious couple that would be in the room beside them. The woman chuckled and shook her head lightly. Ah. We only have one room that we use for the inn. That other room beside yours is a room we rent out to people. It's not really a hotel room like yours, more of a living space, apartment type. So, stop worrying and enjoy yourselves. The woman smiled brightly, her laughter almost infectious as Astrid found a small smile spreading onto her face as well. Come on then, babe, Astrid called out to Hiccup behind her and grabbed his hand, knotting her fingers between his as she pulled him up the stairs with her. The name was unfamiliar to Hiccup, and he wasn't sure whether he liked it or not, but followed Astrid along anyway. Meanwhile, the woman who had given the key watched them go with a wistful look and a nostalgic look in her eyes, remembering the times when she was young and in love. Oh. And try not to make too much noise. Some of us are light sleepers, you know. The woman called after them, watching the couple disappear up the stairs and towards their room. Ah, young love. I remember when my husband and I were like that, so eager to find a room together. Alone. She reminisced quietly, her memories comforting her as she stood dazing dreamily behind the bar. After dragging Hiccup up the stairs and into the room that they were given the key to, Astrid shoved Hiccup into the room and shut the door tight. Her ear pressed up against the door as she listened to the outside carefully, making sure that the woman or her husband hadn't followed them upstairs and started spying on them. What in Thor's name was that about? Why did you drag me up here like that? Hiccup asked in confusion, his arms crossing over his chest as he felt very uncomfortable with the situation he was shoved into. Astrid didn't look his way for a few moments before letting out a short, but exhausted, sigh. Look, Astrid started, standing up away from the door and sitting down on the one double bed in the middle of the room. It was a small room, but it wasn't cramped enough that the double bed seemed to intrude on the space as Astrid sat upon it. The people here are nice, pure and innocent people. I don't really want them to know about our situation, that we have this whole fake, arranged marriage thing going on. Things in the city are odd and unusual to them. I like them, they are good people. Astrid sighed again, resting her arms on her knees as she leaned forward, dropping her head. You don't want them to know about our real relationship because you're scared of what they will think of you. Hiccup finished her thought, taking a seat beside her on the bed. I know it's stupid, but here I can be myself and be who I normally am without judgment. They like me here, they like who I really am. I don't want to ruin that by telling them that I have this complicated fake marriage to this big business heir. They might think less of me. Astrid sighed, shaking her head sadly as her mind flooded with various scary thoughts. Hiccup placed a gentle hand on her thigh and patted it gently in reassurance and friendliness. Astrid, it's okay. I get it. You like these people, and it's clear they like you. I would never do anything to ruin that for you. Hiccup smiled lovingly at her as her head slowly raised to meet his eye. For a few moments, their gazes locked and neither of them could look away from each other, their eyes boring into each other without wanting to look away. Astrid admired the forest green color of Hiccup's irises, the vast space that hid behind them seemed to reach out to her and beg her to explore every inch of him. Hiccup felt as though he was drowning in Astrid's ocean blue eyes, their waves engulfing him by her strength as they took his breath away. Thank you, Hiccup. Astrid spoke out, breaking the tense silence that had settled between them and finally breaking their destructive staring contest. Hiccup cleared his throat and withdrew his hand away from Astrid's thigh and rubbed it upon his own thigh, wanting to rid it of all the sweat that was beginning to build upon it. He chuckled beneath his breath and looked ahead to the door and around the room. Its space was small and cramped, even with only one bed, and without any bags to unpack they sat in silence and stillness. So, since we have nothing to do until tomorrow, you wanna go out and get something to eat? Chapter 36, Chapter 35. Chapter text. You almost lost your leg. How? Well, it was in our old house and there was a pretty big fire, probably taking over the whole house, and my dad had called the fire department but they were late getting to the house. When he started to drag me out of the house, I noticed our dog was missing. The dog belonged to my mom and his name was Cloudjumper. Anyway, I ran away from my dad back into the house to go find him, and when I found him he was trapped in his dog house in the kitchen. So I ripped open the cage and started carrying him out of the house, bearing in mind I was about 15 at the time. As we got close to the door, a massive explosion of fire came up behind me and I had to do all I could to run out of the house before it could get to me. I jumped out through the door and my leg was left behind, but luckily the fire didn't reach that far. Hiccup told Astrid with a scarred look in his eye, the fire still alive in his memory and it was just as hot. The two of them were walking along the beach together after just having had their dinner and the sun was starting to set behind the horizon. Their feet trudged through the sand, having taken their shoes off and holding them in their hands as they walked over the soft, cold sand. Both had been telling stories about themselves when they were younger, unbelievable things, things that were scarring and things that nearly happened. What about you? Hiccup asked, turning to Astrid to repeat the question she had asked him earlier. What was one of the most traumatic events that happened in your life? Astrid thought for a moment, tapping her chin lightly with her finger as she thought, the action causing a smile to spread onto Hiccup's face as he found the action to be quite cute. At first, nothing came to Astrid's mind, only mildly irritating or scary incidents came to mind. Until she was reminded of her college years, and that one party. Well, okay. Since you told yours, I'll tell mine. She took in a deep breath. It was in college and my friend and I had been invited to a party. It was a college frat boy type of party and it was clear that once we got there, it was a drug party and everyone was already wasted. Now, I had never been to a drug party before, and after that night, I've never been to one since. But basically, it's a party where I know what a drug party is. I went to college. Hiccup interjected, cutting Astrid off. She paused for a moment as her throat dried up slightly, the words dying in her mouth. Okay. She nodded and continued her story. Anyway, so we got there and thought we'd just ride the party out and see how it went. So we had been there for a couple of hours and I was starting to get a little bored. I was only slightly buzzed because of all the alcohol that had already been used for some guy's keg stand and there wasn't much to be had, and many were too drugged up to drink anyway. So I decided to go look for my friend, who I had lost sight of throughout the party, but I couldn't find her anywhere. I looked all over, in bedrooms, in bathrooms, the backyard, everywhere. It was like she had disappeared. Anyway, I said to myself, oh well, maybe she went home and forgot to tell me or couldn't find me either, so I decided to leave and head back to the dorm without her, thinking that maybe she was at the dorm. You left your friend at the party, alone? Hiccup asked judgmentally, a raised eyebrow sent her way as they slowed their walk along the beach. Hey. This is my story time, and I know. It sounds bad, and honestly, I still feel guilty about it. Astrid groaned, anger and regret filling her voice as she was forced to recall the traumatic event. Back to my story, I was out of the house and walking along the front yard when this tall, bulky group of jocks walked up to me and towered over me. Seriously, they must have been like 7 feet tall or something, I swear. Anyway, they basically grabbed me and picked me up off the ground and dragged me over to some part of the driveway that was hidden from other partygoers and started groping me, ripping clothes off me, and basically trying to have their way with me. Astrid paused and took another deep breath. But luckily I had been trained in martial arts, so when they had their guard down, and they were also pretty wasted, I managed to break free and I started pelting it across the lawn and down the road, eventually finding a place to hide in someone else's yard until they gave up and went back to the party. Astrid finished, and the air between them was tense and silent. Neither one of them spoke a word. Okay, you win, Hiccup announced with a wry smile, nudging Astrid's shoulder with his own in a friendly, comforting way. His action caused a smile to form on Astrid's face as she felt warmed by his touch and smiled as he looked down at her. It wasn't a competition, Astrid stated plainly, trying to hide the smile on her face as they wandered down the beach together. Yes, but I think you deserve a win after having the courage to tell me all of that. There should be a prize for you. Hiccup tapped his chin theatrically and looked about him, genuinely trying to think of a good winner's ceremony idea for Astrid. But there wasn't much to look at on the beach, apart from the sand. As his eyes scanned his surroundings, his eye caught something that sparked an idea in his mind that he knew Astrid wouldn't be pleased about, but it certainly excited Hiccup. He turned to Astrid with a smirk plastered across his face, a mischievous look in his eye as he jumped in front of Astrid and stopped her dead in her tracks. "Hey! Have you ever been in the ocean before?" he asked wryly, a hint of mischief and adventure behind his eye as he smiled at Astrid as innocently as he possibly could. Astrid furrowed her brow and responded to his smile with a confused look. "What are you talking about?" "No, I haven't ever been in the ocean, although I have swum before but not in the sea." "Hey! What are you doing?" Astrid screamed as Hiccup picked her up bridal style from the floor and walked with her in his arms, into the sea. "I'm giving you the experience of swimming in the sea. You know, it's a must-do experience." He chuckled as he held a frantic, resistant Astrid in his arms above the water. Hiccup had managed to wade into about a foot of water, his jeans getting wet as the waves splashed onto his clothes. But he didn't stop as he continued to walk further into the sea. Astrid was desperately trying to free herself from his grip and run away, however, as she realized how far they were getting into the sea, she stopped. Her arms wrapped around Hiccup and she clung to his body like a baby panda. Her grip turned to iron and she wouldn't let go. "I swear to Odin, Hiccup. If you drop me in the sea I will beat your ass up." She seethed, her words spat through gritted teeth as she was hauled further and further into the sea. The water seemed as though it was getting closer and closer with each step Hiccup took into the ocean, his smile only widening with every step. "Okay." He smiled and dropped her into the ocean. "Hiccup!" She screams as she falls into the ocean, the water crashing around them and soaking Hiccup in its wake as Astrid connects with the water's surface violently from the air. Hiccup couldn't stifle his laugh any longer and burst out with an enormous, childlike laugh that was so raucous and loud that it made his lungs hurt as he doubled over in pain from the lack of breath. He was almost falling into the water in laughter when Astrid finally appeared from beneath the water's surface and she was soaked from head to foot in the water, the salty sea water stinging her eyes slightly, but she was too angry to care about that. Watching Hiccup laugh only made Astrid more upset and to retaliate she splashed a big tidal wave onto his face, the waves helping push more water onto him as she splashed him angrily. Hiccup's giggle soon calmed and subsided as the water splash shocked his body, yet the smile was still prominent on his face as he looked at Astrid with a raised eyebrow. "So you wanna play like that, huh?" he remarks before splashing her with an equally large volume of water aimed at her. Unfortunately, due to the depth of water she was in, Astrid could not escape the blast and was hit full on in the face by the attack. Smiling, she started splashing him back, Hiccup quickly following and starting a whole water fight in the ocean, the air between them filled with laughter and friendly smiles. Both of them forgot about their worries and stresses as they splashed each other in cold, salty seawater for a solid 10 minutes. Hiccup reveled in the beauty of Astrid as the dimming sunlight lit up her features in a way that made her seem like a model, her eyes capturing him instantly with every look. He swore she was a goddess and wished to see her, wanting to impress him, to see what kind of beauty she could create when she thought she didn't look good. Because frankly, as Hiccup thought in that moment, Astrid could look good in anything. Astrid noticed Hiccup's stares but tried to wash them away by splashing him with more water, soaking his clothes and hair in more salty water to wash away his dazed expressions. But as she splashed him, his chiseled chest and body became more prominent as his shirt stuck to his body in a way that hid no part of him. She felt as though he was shirtless before her, and the thought made her blush, and the fun of splashing each other with water soon died out on her. "We should probably get back to shore and dry these clothes, we haven't got any spares after all," Astrid announced, snapping Hiccup out of his trance. Hiccup eagerly nodded in agreement and followed her out of the water. The going was slow, their knees reaching higher and higher with each step as they tried to haul their bodies out of the water and back onto dry land. Once there, Hiccup started to undress, removing his shirt behind Astrid who was in front of him. When she turned around and saw him undressing before her, she squeaked and shielded her eyes, quickly turning away from him in embarrassment and shock. What are you doing? She asked in shock, her cheeks turning as red as a tomato as the image of Hiccup's shirtless form had become engraved in her memory only from one small snapshot. What do you think I am doing? Taking my shirt off to dry it. Hiccup answered nonchalantly, as though his actions posed no real shock or threat to Astrid's sanity. Hiccup saw some rocks near the promenade, just on the edge of the beach, and decided that that would be the best place to sit and rest until their clothes dried off on their bodies. Obviously, it would take some more time than usual because they didn't have any towels to speed up the process, but Hiccup found a comfortable rock and sat on it. Still without a shirt. Come on, Astrid. Are you gonna stand there all day? He called out to her, Astrid still being stood where he had left her on the shoreline. Snapping back to reality, Astrid looked at the shore and back over to Hiccup and shook her head to rid herself of any mysterious thoughts she was having. Quickly moving her legs, she jogged as best she could over the sand and joined Hiccup on the rocks by the promenade, waiting for her clothes to dry whilst watching the sunset over the horizon. The minutes seemed to pass by relatively peacefully, the breeze blowing through their wet clothes and hair like they were driving down an open road with the roof down. Astrid looked out onto the ocean, admiring the sun's reflection on the ocean's surface as it shone beautifully on the water. She had always wanted to see the sunset, the beautiful orange and yellows as it descended beyond the horizon and out of view. But the sight was something more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. Hiccup, meanwhile, had found a stick among the rocks and watched Astrid's amazed face as she watched the sunset. An unconscious smile formed on his face as he looked upon her beauty, and he found himself drawing her face in the sand. He made sure to capture every feature, even if the wet sand beneath them wasn't the best drawing pad for him. But he wanted to capture that moment, that expression. What are you doing? Astrid asked him, breaking his concentration and causing him to jump slightly. When his gaze looked up to Astrid, he saw her eyes looking down upon the portrait of her in the sand and he felt his cheeks heat up. It's nothing, just drawing in the sand. Is that supposed to be me? Is that why it's nothing? Astrid joked, giggling at her own words before raising an eyebrow. But why draw me? Hiccup froze, he didn't have an explanation for that. He didn't even realize he was drawing her until a few moments ago. It had been so unconscious in his mind that he had just done it, no thoughts had gone into it whatsoever. But when Astrid asked him why he had done it, he felt embarrassed to have even subconsciously drawn her. Oh. Hiccup stuttered, unable to complete his sentence as he babbled. Astrid giggled at his cute, embarrassed reaction, her question taking him by surprise. She smiled at him and shrugged it off, looking back over to the sunset on the horizon. No need to explain yourself. Keep going, I want to see the final product. She smiled, leaning back onto the rock with her arms out behind her to hold up her figure as she looked ahead. Hiccup looked up to her and tilted his head slightly in confusion and surprise. She wanted him to keep going. She didn't find it weird. Hiccup shook his head, removing any theories or assumptions from his mind and continued with the portrait. As you wish, milady. He muttered beneath his breath as he continued with his drawing. Asterisk 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 asterisk. The sun had set and the moon was rising in the sky, darkness was seeping into the night, and Hiccup and Astrid were still sitting on the rocks on the beach. Hiccup had finished his drawing of Astrid and they were now just waiting for the night to roll in and they could go to bed and wait until tomorrow arrives. Hiccup checked his watch to see that it was only 10 o'clock, and he was getting rather hungry and thirsty. What he really wanted was a drink, and an alcoholic drink at that. But he was unsure how to ask Astrid for that, so he stayed quiet. Soon, the promenade started to come to life, and they heard a window, or a door, swing open and a musical blast came rushing through the open portal. Their ears were filled with an indie, classical genre that neither of them had heard before. But they both felt enraptured by the sound of the music. Astrid started slowly swaying to the music, enjoying the beat, whereas Hiccup watched Astrid's unconscious swaying and an idea popped into his head. Jumping up from the rock and standing in front of her, Hiccup held out a hand and smiled brightly at her with an enthusiastic grin. Astrid didn't notice him at first, but when her eyes finally opened she saw Hiccup standing before her with a hand out asking for hers. Hiccup, what are you doing? She asked with a slight chuckle in her voice. but Hiccup just smiled and bowed with his hand still out waiting for her. "May I have this dance, milady?" he asked courteously, as though he were in the medieval era asking a princess for a dance. Astrid played along with his fanciful, posh speak and placed her hand in his, daintily dismounting from the rock. "Why yes, fine sir. You may." She smiled and was twirled around by Hiccup before being thrust into his arms. Astrid placed a hand on Hiccup's shoulder and her other hand remained placed in his grasp on her hand infusing her body with a warmth she hadn't felt before. Her eyes first looked at their position, her hand in his and her hand touching his body. But then her eyes drifted to his, and their gazes met as Hiccup gave her an adorable toothy grin. "Shall we?" Astrid smiled, allowing Hiccup to take the first step. He seemed to flow into the music, allowing Astrid to follow along, their bodies absorbing the music together as they danced in the sand. They twirled and laughed together, their steps in time with the beat, never truly understanding their rhythm. They just danced. Hiccup had never felt as close to Astrid as he did at that moment, and he felt as though a wall had been broken between them and he could finally see Astrid without her mask for the first time. He could see her, all of her, and he loved everything he saw. There were no illusions, no masks, no sarcastic quips to hide insecurities. It was just them, and the music. Nothing could stop their movements as they flowed with the tune, the rhythm coming to them as though it was what they were always destined to do. They were destined for more than they allowed themselves. "Hey, it's getting late," Astrid spoke up, stilling their dance to a gentle sway as their eyes gazed into each other, their breaths mingling together as though they were dancing on their own. Hiccup nodded, not yet letting go of Astrid's hand or her waist. "Yeah, we'd better head inside. You care for a nightcap?" "We'll see." Chapter 37, Chapter 36. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. They finally made their way back onto the promenade. The hard concrete of the road and pavement beneath their feet made the walk back to the inn much easier than if they had stayed on the sand. The sand beneath their feet was soft and bumpy, it was uneven and a natural trip hazard for everyone who ever crossed it. As they walked along the promenade, Astrid gazed out towards the ocean and admired the moon's reflection on the rippling water. She listened to the waves crashing against the shore of the beach, rushing across the sand as it raced closer to the promenade. However, due to her distraction, she didn't take much care with her feet and ended up stumbling over her own feet in a foolish and clumsy maneuver. "Whoa!" she yelled out as she fell to the floor suddenly, taking Hiccup by surprise as he leapt down to the floor to check whether she was okay. "Astrid. You okay?" he asked worriedly, his eyes flickering across her body as though he was a robot scanning for injuries. "Yeah, I'm fine." Astrid waved him off and began to stand up off of the floor. However, as she began to put weight onto her left foot, she fell back down to the floor with a cry of agony and her hand gripping the joint upon reflex. "Astrid. What's wrong?" Hiccup asked again, panic and worry seeping into his voice. He wasn't sure whether she had just twisted her ankle, or whether she had broken the whole foot. The thoughts terrified him, but luckily Astrid wasn't looking at his face and was more concerned with her injury. "Oh, damn it. I think I've twisted my ankle a bit. I'll be fine, just need to be careful." "No, you're not fine," Hiccup announced and crawled in front of Astrid. He waited there in front of her, still crouched down on the ground, and Astrid sat behind him wearing a confused expression. "What are you doing?" Astrid quirked her head, her hand still wrapped around her ankle as she tried to apply a small amount of pressure on the injury to lessen the pain. Hiccup looked over his shoulder at her and gave her a small smile whilst gesturing to his back with a small quirk of his head. "Hop on." "What?" Astrid chuckled, realizing what Hiccup was offering her, and the fact brought a smile to her face. "You want to give me a piggyback ride?" she asked, an eyebrow raised as she tried to understand his intentions. Hiccup just shrugged and started to slowly rise from a crouch. "Well, if you want to walk around on a twisted ankle then be carried back, then I'll..." "Wait. Wait." Astrid yelled out, pulling Hiccup back down to her level and crouched back down in front of her with his back presented to her. "If you're offering, then it would be rude to refuse, right? Hop on then, milady." Hiccup chuckled as he felt Astrid clamber onto his back. Quickly wrapping his arms underneath her thighs to give her extra support and make sure she didn't fall, Hiccup began to stand up with Astrid clinging to his back like a monkey. Once he stood up and gave a small glance over his shoulder to check that she was alright, Hiccup started walking back to the hotel whilst carrying Astrid on his back. It wasn't a long walk, but neither was it a short one. The journey probably only took them 4 or 5 minutes, but to Hiccup carrying Astrid on his back, it felt like 10. Once they arrived outside the door to the inn, Hiccup slowly placed Astrid back on the ground and stood before her with an abashed and exhausted look on his face. "Was I that heavy?" Astrid asked with a chuckle in her voice as she noticed Hiccup's red face in the darkness of the night. She smiled as she watched Hiccup scratch the back of his neck, an action she recognized as a nervous twitch. "Not really, it's just." He paused, unsure how to describe his reasoning and make it sound coherent. "I didn't want to carry you up the stairs to the room if there was anyone inside." Hiccup explained, but it didn't sound any better coming out of his mouth than in his head. "It's fine, Hiccup. Honestly, I was going to suggest you drop me outside anyway and I'll walk from there. It's okay, don't sweat." "Really?" Hiccup asked, pausing his motion of scratching his neck as he looked at Astrid with a hopeful look. She smiled and gave a short nod in reply. "Come on, let's get inside." As they opened the door into the inn, a torrent of air hit them like a ton of bricks and it smelled like alcohol. The smell that hit them on the way inside the inn was the same smell that they had smelled when they had first entered the inn earlier that day. Hiccup winced at the smell, whereas Astrid was more accustomed to a strong smell such as this one. Hobbling her way inside, Astrid tried to make her way over to the stairs to head to their room. However, as she made it further inside the inn there was a familiar group of people sitting around a large circular table, all with a pint in front of them and raucous laughter amongst them. "Astrid." A loud, familiar, friendly voice called out to them and Astrid turned towards the voice. Her eyes fell upon the figure of Neil and her eyes widened out of surprise and a small smile appeared on her face. Hiccup wanted to avoid them, much preferring to head upstairs, sleep the day off and get tomorrow over with. However, as Astrid approached the table and greeted them warmly, he knew that wasn't going to be the case. So, being the responsible husband he was, he stayed by Astrid's side and joined her and her newfound friends for a few rounds of drinks. "So how long have you two been together?" one of the men that they were sat with, named Sully, asked. Hiccup and Astrid froze for a moment, turning to each other for a split second before Astrid spoke up. 5 years. She replied confidently, giving a small side-eye to Hiccup. Although, Hiccup wasn't going to protest anything that she was saying. "How did you meet?" Neil asked, intrigued by the young couple sitting with them. Astrid hesitated, unsure how to answer and she took a large swig of the beer in front of her. Hiccup chuckled at her actions and looked over to the men around them with a smile, knowing his answer. "She bumped into me in one of the corridors at work and spilled coffee all over me. I yelled at her, but she stopped me in my tracks by blaming me and it was that sass that made me believe she was different from any other girl I had met before." Hiccup turned to look at Astrid who had been looking at him with a curious gaze. "No girl had ever spoken down to me like that before. She was fiercely sexy, and it was then that I knew I had fallen hard. It was like love at first fight." Hiccup chuckled, and the men around the table laughed along with him. "Besides, look at her." He gestured towards Astrid as though he were showing off some merchandise. "She's beautiful." The men cheered and nodded in agreement, clinking their glasses with Hiccup as they condoned his beautiful words. His story sounded like a fairy tale, and it was realistic enough that it was instantly believed by the men at the table. But Astrid was speechless, her eyes lost in Hiccup's as he stared at her with a warm smile. She was confused and raised a small eyebrow. Leaning closer whilst the men were laughing and taking another sip of their beers, she whispered to him. "Nice save. Where did you come up with that kind of story?" Astrid asked curiously, but Hiccup gave her a confused look in return. Tilting his head slightly in amused confusion, Hiccup let out a soft exhale and smiled. "Astrid. That is how we met." "Oh." Astrid replied stiffly and turned away in embarrassment, her cheeks blushing slightly as she realized that she had forgotten about their first encounter. Yet, curiously, Hiccup hadn't. "I'm surprised you fell in love with her at the first fight." Neil chuckled, taking another sip of his beer. "I fell in love with my wife after our first kiss." When I tasted those sweet lips for the first time I knew I would never kiss another like her again. He dreamily reminisced on the past, his eyes wandering up to the ceiling with a look of wistfulness and a bright smile. What about you two? Another man, Stefan, asked. I believe that every kiss you have with the girl you love should feel as though you are kissing her for the first time. That feeling, you know. That feeling of joy, of heat, of love, of passion. It's all there in the first kiss. Stefan proclaimed, his words as though they had come straight out of a movie. But Hiccup couldn't decipher what movie he was quoting as he wasn't a particularly eager rom-com movie buff like Stefan might have been. Yeah, show us. Show us how you kiss the girl you love. Neil announced, begging for the moment of truth. But Hiccup and Astrid sprung to life immediately, their hands shaking and hearts beating rapidly inside their chests. A panic set in. No, no. They both said in sync. I mean, we don't kiss often. It saves the spark, you know. That first time feeling you were talking about. Astrid tried to save them, but the men around her didn't seem to believe her. Oh come on. Sully complained, his voice booming out into the inn as though he was speaking through a megaphone. You're not getting any younger. You're married and in love. I'm beginning to forget what that's like. Now come on and show us. He slammed the table with his hand, slapping the skin onto the hard wooden table in a violently jovial manner. Kiss the girl. Astrid froze, her breath hitched into her throat as she felt her body lock up. She couldn't move, she couldn't escape, and she was starting to panic. She was actually going to have to kiss Hiccup in front of these men, and the thought terrified her. It wasn't as if it was their first ever kiss, they had kissed before. But not in front of people. Until she felt a soft hand grab her cheek and turn her head. As her head turned, she was faced with Hiccup's approaching face, his eyes focused on her lips, and before she could protest or register his actions, he kissed her. As soon as his lips landed upon hers, the world seemed to fall away. She was no longer sitting at the table with three old men staring at the two of them, watching their kiss as though they were watching a rom-com. Hiccup's lips pulled away for a moment, taking in a sharp breath before Astrid wrapped her arms around his neck lazily and pulled him back in, their lips like magnets and the tension between them pulling their lips together. Astrid couldn't stop herself. So, Hiccup had to. Pulling away suddenly, both Hiccup and Astrid looked at each other in a moment of silence, their brains thinking over what they had just done. They had broken a rule. But they had broken it together, so that should be better. Right. Hiccup finally pulled away and sat back on his chair fully and turned to the men with a broad smile, opening his arms out in triumph and accomplishment at their challenge. Astrid couldn't stop the blush that was beginning to dust her cheeks. There you go. Hiccup announced, his arms out in proclamation before he brought them back down to the table and downed the rest of his drink. How's that for a kiss? He boasted, the men agreeing with him whilst Astrid took up her glass and began chugging away at her drink. Astrid soon finished her drink, quickly ordering another one for herself and Hiccup. They felt as though they needed the alcohol, to forget about what they had just done. But no one seemed to question it, and the event was never mentioned again for the rest of the night. But time wore on, and it was very late and beginning to get into the early hours of the morning. Hiccup thought he read 3 a.m. on his watch, but he was quite dizzy and drunk from the 6 pints of beer he had drunk that he wasn't sure what time it was. Astrid was much the same and was slightly swaying in her seat, almost losing her balance and falling off the chair and onto the floor. Okay. Hiccup announced as he caught Astrid from falling onto the floor as she swayed in her seat. The other men at the table had either gone home or fallen asleep at the table, their heads flopped on top of the wooden table in front of them. Time to get you to bed then, right? Hiccup asked, swaying slightly himself, but he thought Astrid was a bit more wasted than him. Yeah, I think you're right. Astrid agreed in a strangely sober tone. Hiccup nodded and helped her up, Astrid struggling to hold her weight up anymore from the vast amount of alcohol trying to work its way through her system. The journey up the stairs was a long one, and an awkward one, Hiccup occasionally losing grip and Astrid stumbling up a few steps. Eventually, they made it to their room and flung the door open, causing it to slam back on its hinges and swing back closed with a violent thud. Hiccup slightly winced from the noise, afraid that they may have woken up the other residents in the building before turning back to watch Astrid crawl into bed. You okay there, Astrid? Hiccup asked as he watched Astrid crawl from the bottom of the bed to the headboard and slowly make her way under the covers. I'm fine, come in. She invited him, and Hiccup obliged. After snuggling underneath the covers together, Astrid turned around to face Hiccup, their faces only a few inches apart and the feeling of their breaths tickling their skin. Astrid had wanted to say something, but the look on Hiccup's face entranced her, and the words died in her throat. Gods, I want to kiss you right now. Hiccup whispered aloud, thinking he had thought it in his head. But Astrid looked up from his lips and gazed into his eyes with a shy smile. Then kiss me. After raising a curious eyebrow, Hiccup needn't any further instruction. Hiccup connected his lips onto Astrid's and slowly crawled his way on top of her so that both of his hands propped up his body above Astrid's, with each one on either side of her head. He kissed her with such passion and fury that it left Astrid desperate for more as she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him in closer than before. Pulling away for a moment, both of them panting like athletes having run a marathon, Hiccup slowly tucked a piece of loose hair out of Astrid's face. How far are you willing to take this, milady? I'll let you know, Astrid replied and pulled Hiccup in for another kiss. Neither one of them knew how the night escalated from there, none of them remembered when they had taken off their clothes that night. They just remember the desire they felt and the heat burning through their bodies as they rutted against each other, every time begging for more. Astrid wanted to feel every inch of Hiccup, whilst Hiccup wanted to reach deeper and feel Astrid react to him in a way he knew she had never felt before. Even though it was his first time, and he would barely remember a moment of it the next day, he didn't want it to have been with anyone else. Notes. Uncut version of what happens at the inn to come soon. Chapter 38, Chapter 36, Uncut. Notes. This chapter is an add-on to the previous chapter. So, if you don't like to read explicit Hickstrid scenes, then feel free to skip this chapter as you won't be missing anything important to the story. However, if you do like to read this kind of sexually explicit nonsense, then this chapter is for you. Come on down and indulge yourself in this drabble of smutty nonsense that I managed to cobble together. Chapter text. The journey up the stairs was a long one, and an awkward one, Hiccup occasionally losing grip and Astrid stumbling up a few steps. Eventually, they made it to their room and flung the door open, causing it to slam back on its hinges and swing back closed with a violent thud. Hiccup slightly winced from the noise, afraid that they may have woken up the other residents in the building before turning back to watch Astrid crawl into bed. You okay there, Astrid? Hiccup asked as he watched Astrid crawl from the bottom of the bed to the headboard and slowly make her way under the covers. I'm fine, come in. She invited him, and Hiccup obliged. After snuggling underneath the covers together, Astrid turned around to face Hiccup, their faces only a few inches apart and the feeling of their breaths tickling their skin. Astrid had wanted to say something, but the look on Hiccup's face entranced her, and the words died in her throat. Gods, I want to kiss you right now. Hiccup whispered aloud, thinking he had thought it in his head. But Astrid looked up from his lips and gazed into his eyes with a shy smile. Then kiss me. After raising a curious eyebrow, Hiccup needn't any further instruction. Hiccup connected his lips to Astrid's and slowly crawled his way on top of her so that both of his arms supported his body above Astrid's, with each one on either side of her head. He kissed her with such passion and fury that it left Astrid desperate for more as she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him in closer than before. Pulling away for a moment, both of them panting like athletes having run a marathon. Hiccup slowly tucked a piece of loose hair out of Astrid's face. How far are you willing to take this, milady? I'll let you know, Astrid replied and pulled Hiccup in for another kiss. This kiss was more certain, more determined, and let Hiccup know that this wasn't any temporary thing. Astrid was willing to go as far as Hiccup was willing to push her, and Hiccup wasn't even sure where his line was. Emotions spread through him like wildfire and he felt an uncontrollable urge to have all of her. To own, to dominate, to cherish, and to love. Some parts felt possessive, whilst others only wished to care and nurture the divine beauty panting and clawing at him from beneath his unattractive body. Hiccup was unsure what spectral deity had granted him this unholy wish, to corrupt and obtain an angel such as Astrid, but Hiccup wasn't about to complain about any of it as he threw the sheets away from their bodies and tore his shirt over his head. He felt Astrid's hands reaching out to him, tenderly pressing her fingertips to the divots of his chest and the smooth contours of his stomach. Her sudden intake of breath as her fingers trekked further across his skin did not escape Hiccup's notice. Smiling to himself, Hiccup dove back towards Astrid's lips, entrapping them in a tantalizing, toe-curling kiss, one that Astrid reciprocated with as much love and fury as Hiccup was giving her. Their lips locked in a lustful duel, each battling to dominate the battlefield between their sheets as more items of clothing were eliminated. Soon, Hiccup was looking upon a sight that almost blinded him with utter envious lust, his heart hammering in his chest as a warmth spread rapidly through his body. This warmth had only one destination in mind, and Hiccup was unsure whether this was the route that Astrid had in mind. His fingers carefully traced the outline of her shoulder, dusting over the skin of her neck as he took in the artwork beneath his touch. A breath caught in his throat as his eyes met Astrid's, twinkling beneath the dark shadows of their room, her chest heaving with drunken desire. "Are you sure this is what you want?" Hiccup whispered, a moment of doubt flickering in his chest as he peered at her flushed features. He could no longer tell whether that had been a result of his heavenly, yet unpracticed, movements or the aftermath of the drinks from earlier. Astrid smiled, cupping Hiccup's cheeks in her palms as she pulled him closer. Her breath danced across his lips as she left his face hovering before hers, the words desperately teetering on her tongue. "Hiccup, I've been wanting this for a while. I may not have believed it, but having you in front of me now makes me certain that this is what I want," Astrid affirmed, her voice just above a whisper as each word cascaded across Hiccup's skin and tickled his ears like a radiant fantasy. "Astrid," Hiccup growled, his head shaking free from her grasp and settling upon her shoulders with a sigh. "You always have to make things harder for me." His admission was quickly met with confusion from Astrid. Pulling away from the shadows of her body, Hiccup moved his face back into her vision and let a devilish smile tug at his lips. "Whenever it gets too much, tell me and I'll stop. Understand?" Astrid nodded eagerly. Her assent was immediately replied with a small smile and Hiccup kissed his way across her body. Astrid's breath was stolen from her lungs instantly. Her chest heaved from the warm magic of his feather-like touch, each kiss sending a frenzy of lust-filled urges through her body that made her movements very hard to control. Heat spread through her body like an electric current and her body responded to everything Hiccup did with exceedingly alluring results. Astrid wasn't sure whether she had ever been treated this way before, and at that moment, she didn't care to think much of it. All of her mind had become consumed by the thoughts of Hiccup and where his mouth was venturing as he slowly but surely made his way down her body, soon reaching the outline of her underwear. With an unsure, but steady, grip they fell away from her waist and joined the pile on the floor. Hiccup hovered over the untamed heat and looked back to Astrid for reassurance, placing a tentative kiss on her thigh as he waited for her approval. An approval that Astrid could not find the words to utter. But Hiccup obtained one through a simple, but difficult nod. Smiling lightly, partially understanding the effect his touch had upon her body, Hiccup delved deeper into her body than he had ever explored before. A shiver ripped through Astrid's body as Hiccup's tongue touched her sex, the warmth and thrill that erupted from there exploding throughout her body like a firework. Hiccup pulled away slightly, nervously checking Astrid's reaction, until she grabbed his hair and pulled him back into position. Upon her encouragement, Hiccup needed no further instruction and let Astrid's body lead him to her treasure, the pleasure that many men had struggled to find. Astrid couldn't be sure whether it was Hiccup's touch alone that was causing this overwhelmingly hot flush to rocket through her body so naturally, but she was certain it wasn't the alcohol. She had pleasured herself in the comfort of her own sheets in the darkness of the moon before, but never had she had such an intense reaction from her body. Hiccup was exploring and discovering her body in a way that Astrid had never known before, the intense and burning lust sparking from within her dominating her like nothing she had ever known. With each slide of his tongue and kiss upon her heat, Astrid climbed higher and higher into ecstasy, desperate to jump from the cliff that Hiccup's movements were dangling so tantalizingly close before her. Every flick of his tongue against her most sensitive parts drove Astrid wild, and her high ever closer, her fingers knotting into his hair as he pushed her closer and closer towards the edge. For once, everything seemed perfectly in line. As though every answer to every question that Astrid had always wanted to ask herself became undeniably clear. The passionate thrill of unbridled heat that flooded through her upon the release of her desire was a feeling that Astrid never thought she could experience. Toppling over the cliff, Astrid climaxed in such a way that she had to tear Hiccup's face away from her so that her overly sensitive skin did not collapse her into further ecstasy, and she could not move for the rest of the night. Her mind ran blank as every star in the night sky filled her vision, and every muscle in her body twitched with wanton abandon, discovering this new wild power of her orgasm that seemed to rip through her body with such ardent energy. Cooling down from her high, Astrid looked down at Hiccup, who had removed his pants and underwear and was now toying with a foil packet between his fingers. He watched Astrid follow his movements, smiling to himself as though he could see the thoughts whirring slowly in her mind. Leaning forward, he towered over Astrid, shadowing her body beneath his. He hovered the foil packet between them with a cheeky smile, and Astrid furrowed her brow as a sudden thought occurred to her at its appearance. "Did you bring those with you?" Astrid chuckled, still confused and drained from her mind-blowing orgasm. Hiccup smiled as he waved the packet between their faces and turned it over in his hand. "No, neither of us planned to stay the night here, milady." Hiccup chuckled, thinking back to their escapade that led them to this mysteriously conservative B&B. Confusion veiled Astrid's face further as she looked between the condom and Hiccup's seemingly innocent expression. "Then where did you get it?" Desperate to touch him again, Astrid instinctively reached up a hand to stroke Hiccup's hair, feeling the soft strands of untamed mane beneath her fingers. Hiccup leaned into her touch gently as his eyes closed in a moment of sensual heaven. "One of the guys downstairs slipped it into my trousers when we were on our way up. Seems like it was necessary." Hiccup winked and smiled lightly before letting the expression fall from his face. "Are you still sure about this?" Astrid nodded. "If I wasn't, you'd know by now." "I'm ready, Hiccup." Hiccup nodded, and in a move that Astrid had never witnessed before, he tore open the packet with his teeth in a movement that was as sensually mind-breaking as it sounded. Astrid swore the look in his eye as his teeth tore through the foil could have made her knees buckle had she been standing. However, as he sheathed himself in the condom, he nervously hovered before Astrid's entrance. A sudden wave of hesitancy hit Hiccup like a truck and he couldn't bring himself to penetrate into such a perfect specimen. He couldn't corrupt her with his desires and lust all built up from an impossibly overwhelming hormonal system that he couldn't control. That was the many flaws of Hiccup. He was a man who had needs, and he wasn't sure he could ever reach up to Astrid's expectations. So, Astrid needed to step in. "Want me to lead?" Astrid offered, her words breathy and soft. Her offer laid out between them was not a way of minimizing Hiccup's role, and instead easing him of this obvious tension. It may not have been Astrid's first time in this love affair of sex, but it certainly was Hiccup's. Although Astrid was one to seriously debate that. Hiccup nodded and slowly let himself be eased onto his back as Astrid mounted onto his lap. Slowly but surely she eased his length into her and connected their bodies together in a movement of pure sensual magic. "Oh, gods!" "Astrid," Hiccup breathed, the words leaving him like a final breath and his body electrified from the surge of heat as their bodies connected. Astrid chuckled beneath her breath, already gasping for air as she matched Hiccup's desire. "Hiccup," his name fell from her lips without much thought, disappearing into the demanding tension flooding through the room. "You okay?" Hiccup couldn't help but ask, his hands softly gripping her hips. Astrid couldn't utter a word, all sound failing her as the heightened power of his body had rendered her silent. All Astrid managed to reply with was a single, barely perceivable nod of assent. But Hiccup understood and gently stroked her hips, easing her into motion with cautious movements. "Gods, Astrid. You're so beautiful," Hiccup sighed, feeling Astrid's body moving along his length and deepening his pleasure further. "I don't deserve you." "Don't worry," Astrid managed to announce through exhausted breaths, her lungs unable to keep the oxygen retained to maintain her energy. "Nobody does." She quickly leaned down and pressed a passionate, yet desperate, kiss upon his lips. "The difference is, I chose you." Hiccup smiled, cupping her cheek with a soft touch before Astrid rose away from his face and moved rhythmically along his length. In a single incoherent moment, they both let out a sigh of delight. Hiccup's body felt a rush of endless fervent desire that he had never experienced before. It was a feeling that dreamy nights alone could only painfully fail to capture. This was the real thing, and anything else paled in comparison to this. Hiccup had never been sure whether those actors in those pornos online ever faked what they were feeling, or whether they actually needed to exaggerate such emotions, but now that Hiccup found himself in his own personal dream, he couldn't be sure what to feel. All thoughts disappeared from his mind. The only thing consuming his mind was the divine beauty seated upon him, adjusting herself to his size. Hiccup had no words to describe this moment. Instead, all Hiccup could utter was a single expletive of pleasure as Astrid began to move herself along her length. Easing herself into her own rhythm, Astrid rode Hiccup with such tender attention that Hiccup could no longer be sure what this was. Was this just sex, or was this what people called making love? Almighty Thor, Astrid! You're driving me insane! Hiccup uttered sternly, as though scolding Astrid for twisting his mind into such a corrupted and dizzying state of lust and desire. But Astrid could only smile and maintain her rhythm as she reached for her own ecstasy. His fingers dug into Astrid's hips, guiding her deeper into her seat upon his lap, her legs struggling to keep up with Hiccup's uneven rhythm. But Astrid let him take control, to guide her in the way that he wished, just as she had done for him earlier. She rose to the occasion, and let Hiccup pull her back to earth and feel him penetrate deeper into her with every thrust. Hiccup desired to be closer, he wanted to be deeper. With every rise of Astrid's hips, Hiccup met them with an uncontrollably passionate thrust. He couldn't be sure whether Astrid was encouraging his movements, but he knew that she wasn't against them either. Hiccup, I'm... Oh, gods, Astrid muttered, her head thrown back in exhausted lust as his hips met hers in tandem. Her whispered shouts of pleasure told Hiccup that his improvised efforts of sitting up to kiss her body were a welcome addition to their activity. His lips brushed across her stomach whilst his hands ventured elsewhere, exploring her in such a way that Hiccup would be able to draw a map of Astrid's body with his eyes closed. You look so sexy right now, do you know that? Hiccup whispered into the contours of her body. No one else gets to see you like this. Just me. Is that a promise? Astrid whispered, turning her head to meet Hiccup's eye as he placed a tentative kiss over her breast. Hiccup smiled. If you'll allow me, milady. I'd promise you the world. Astrid gripped Hiccup's hair upon hearing his words, their meaning burying into her heart and devouring her soul as she became completely lost in the moment. Soon, Hiccup's fingers ventured into the space between them, where their bodies met, and let his fingers open up Astrid wider to allow Hiccup deeper access into her entrance. Astrid's breaths became more ragged as Hiccup's touches fueled her desire hotter and her thrust became uneven and unbalanced. Astrid tried her best to keep up with Hiccup's rhythm, but with his honestly romantic touch, Astrid felt her body becoming putty in his arms. Her muscles started to lose energy as she felt her high approaching quickly, causing her to tense around Hiccup's length. Hiccup groaned at the new tension, but it did little to squander his attempts at pleasuring Astrid further. Hiccup, I am, Astrid uttered, her ragged breaths unable to sputter out the words as pleasure and desire overtook her body so completely. Hiccup kissed her neck, burying his head into her warmth as his teeth grazed against her skin. I know, I am too. He managed to squeak out as his thrusts into Astrid's body became more erratic and more hurried. Astrid tensed tighter around Hiccup as his teeth sunk into her neck for the final time before she felt her orgasm explode through her body like a riptide. Hiccup followed soon after, with his desire flooding the condom and bursting throughout his body with uncontrollable twitching. Every emotion he had, Hiccup felt it rip through his chest and burst out of his heart. His fingers felt too hot to touch as he pulled them away from Astrid's skin and let his body collapse onto the bed. Astrid followed, allowing her body to lay exhaustedly over Hiccup's as she struggled to regain her breath. A sense of newfound radiance covered Hiccup's body and a soft, happy sigh expelled from his mouth as his high slowly cascaded down from the roof. He smiled and stroked Astrid's hair as he felt her breaths returning to normal, her head moved to capture him in her vision. Sleep no longer eluded him as the wave of exhaustion that passed over him completely enveloped his body into a state of complete and total peace. Never in his life had he experienced such blissful happiness and fulfillment. Even if his drunken thoughts had clouded his mind and fogged his memory, he would remember this night for as long as he could until he fell asleep. Astrid was not far behind Hiccup as the lure of sleep was too much for her to resist. As the moon hung high above the sea that night, peace descended upon their room as they curled up together in a tangle of desperate arms and tired legs. Chapter 39, Chapter 37. Chapter text. So, that was something new. Astrid was the first one to speak when they woke up that morning, discovering what had happened the night before as the hazy memories came flooding back. Now, They were both sat up against the headboard of the bed, leaning against it with the covers pulled up to cover their chests. Hiccup didn't know where to look, but couldn't bear to look at Astrid after what had just happened between the two of them. "Yeah, I've never done that with you before," Hiccup announced, a slightly sarcastic sense to his tone as he tried to find the humor in their situation. "Have you done it, at all, before?" Astrid asked with a small chuckle in her voice to dissipate the awkwardness she was feeling around them. Hiccup chuckled back and shook his head, lowering it as he did. "You're right, I haven't done that at all before," Hiccup announced with a small laugh. "Do you think it was a mistake?" "Probably. Who knows?" Hiccup replied with a shrug, unsure how to answer as his heart raced in his chest. "Does this mean things are gonna get weird between us?" Astrid asked worriedly, a hint of hesitation seeping into her voice as she stole a glance towards Hiccup. But he continued to stare pointedly ahead and not look her way with all of his might. "No, Astrid." Hiccup sighed, lowering his head and taking in another deep breath. "I won't let this thing between us make anything weird, I mean, any weirder than our current relationship." There was a moment of silence that settled in the room, neither one of them looking at one another and neither one of them looking near each other. Hiccup stared straight ahead upon a spot on the wall, whereas Astrid stared at the door, wondering whether she could make a quick escape. "So, what do we do now?" Astrid asked, finally deciding that she needed to confront this. It wasn't going to go away as if nothing happened, like their kisses. This was serious, and it was something real. Something real that Astrid had wanted to avoid. "Well, I suggest we get dressed, get some breakfast, find that mechanic and then go home." Hiccup announced his plan confidently, Astrid stealing him a small glance as he listed their options. But Hiccup's list didn't feel optional. "So, we're just going to ignore it?" she asked, slightly offended by his words. That was when Hiccup finally stole a glance at Astrid and he took that split second to take in her looks. Her bare shoulders were uncovered and the rest of her body was hidden by the sheets. Her eyes glared at him as though she were willing daggers to fly out from them, and her smile completely faded from her face. It was clear that she was taking this issue seriously. "No. What I'm suggesting is that we don't pretend that it never happened, but we also don't act like it did happen. We're friends, right? Things like this can happen between friends, or so I've heard. We just have to laugh it off and see it as a step closer together, a stronger bond of friendship," Hiccup announced, his words making sense to Astrid as she realized what he was saying and nodded in agreement with his idea. "Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying. That sounds like a plan." The next few minutes played out in silence, apart from the creaking floorboards and rubbing fabric against the skin as Hiccup and Astrid began to put their clothes back on. However, finding their clothes appeared to be the first obstacle in their efforts to start the day. Their shirts were flung halfway across the room, luckily their pants were only by the bed, and their shoes were separated over the bedroom. It was hectic. As Hiccup buttoned up the last button on his shirt, Astrid looked over to him with a raised eyebrow, checking out his odd choice of attire as he pulled his jacket on. Hiccup didn't notice her quizzical looks for the longest time, too busy putting on his shirt and trying to figure out where the missing buttons had gone. "That's a weird fashion choice," Astrid pointed out, her finger gesturing to the top 3 buttons of his shirt being undone and mildly exposing his chest. Hiccup chuckled as he looked down at the area that Astrid had pointed at. "I know, but I had no choice." You always have a choice when it comes to fashion," Astrid replied pointedly, but Hiccup just smiled and shook his head whimsically. "Not when someone ripped off their shirt and pulled off the top 3 buttons." Hiccup replied nonchalantly, despite the small blush that dusted his cheeks as the vague memory flashed before his eyes. Astrid froze and her eyes went wide. Her mouth started to dry up and the words died upon her tongue as she looked at Hiccup, who had returned to his search of the missing buttons. "Did I do that?" she asked, surprised by her own actions. But Hiccup just shrugged and walked over to her, a friendly smile plastering across his face. "It's whatever. Let's just go and get some breakfast." Coming down the stairs brought back more hazy memories from the last night for Hiccup, unlike Astrid who could already remember most of what happened that night. However, as they both reached the bottom of the stairs and saw Sully still asleep on the table from last night, they remembered their kiss. The kiss. Astrid slapped her forehead in exasperation and let out a tired sigh, the hangover becoming present and another headache approaching fast as she rested her hand against her forehead. Soon, the innkeeper woman approached the two of them with a wide, secretive smile. She waddled over to the two of them as though she was about to gossip about the latest trends in the gift shop down the road. Her smile widened as she appeared before them, and leaned in close like there was a secret to keep. "How are the little honeymoon lovebirds doing this morning?" she asked, chipper and excited, her hands wanting to instinctively clap together in excitement. "Very hungover, and starving," Hiccup replied, looking about the inn for a table for them to sit on. "Oh, of course. You must be very hungry for staying up all night making those babies. And I know you really tried, you went for round 2 after all." She winked and walked away, leaving the couple in shocked silence. "It happened twice," Hiccup muttered in confusion, but Astrid's mouth ran dry. "It happened twice." Astrid almost screamed, but her volume made Hiccup jump and he turned to her and slowly patted her shoulder in reassurance. "Hey, it's okay. Right. We'll be fine." Hiccup tried to cheer her up, but Astrid's face began to turn red from both embarrassment and anger. How could this have happened? She muttered to herself in disbelief, her words unintentionally wounding Hiccup as she left him behind to find a suitable place to sit and start their breakfast. "Probably because I couldn't hold myself back. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Okay, I think that's the last of it. Should be as good as new," the mechanic announced as he wiped off the last of the dirty grease spots covering his hands with a used rag. Astrid and Hiccup had managed to find the mechanic as he was arriving back in town, and he immediately helped them haul the car off of the beach and into his workshop. It had been in there for around an hour and the mechanic had only just finished fixing it when he came in to retrieve Astrid and Hiccup from within the silent waiting room. As he entered, he could feel the cold and uncomfortable silence settled in the air between them, their eyes focused on anything but each other despite being a young, married couple. He chalked it up to a little trouble in paradise, maybe a small argument at home brought to their honeymoon. So he just ignored it, it wasn't his business anyway. "Thank you so much," Astrid said exasperatedly, her head bowed slightly as she shook his now cleaned hand in a firm handshake. Hiccup stood up behind Astrid, smiling at the mechanic with a thankful look that was returned. "Hey, you're welcome. It's my job after all. Just don't let me catch you doing it again, otherwise we're gonna have to replace all of the railings along that road." He joked, a heart chuckle added onto the end of his lines as though he were talking to a little kid. Hiccup and Astrid chuckled softly in reply, slightly embarrassed by their public destruction and were more than willing to forget the whole thing if they weren't going to be fined. The mechanic placed the keys back into Astrid's hand with a soft wink, the man only being in his mid-40s, and slinked his way back into his office next to the waiting room. Hiccup's fists balled up from the man's inappropriate gesture to Astrid. "Come on then," Astrid gestured to Hiccup to follow her. "Let's go home." After hopping into the car, and giving the mechanic a very reluctant wave on the way out, Hiccup sat in the passenger seat in total silence. In fact, neither one of them spoke for the first 20 to 30 minutes, until Astrid had had enough and was the first to speak up. "All right. We can't keep ignoring each other like this and keep pretending everything is okay." Astrid let out a very distressed sigh and shook her head, still concentrating on the road ahead of her. "What's up? How are you feeling?" she asked casually, despite the question being a hard one to ask at first. Hiccup shrugged, looking out the window with a passive expression and allowing his mind to run away as he watched the sea and the cliffs fly by as they raced past. Astrid groaned and tried asking again, but Hiccup still refused to speak. "Hiccup!" Astrid yelled, frustrated at the lack of response from Hiccup as he continued to remain silent, which upset Astrid even more. "Fine. I'm upset." "Why? Why are you upset?" "Because the first time I've slept with a girl, the girl I lost my virginity to, I can't remember anything." Hiccup sighed sadly as a moment of awkwardness settled between the two of them. Astrid didn't know what to say, and frankly, neither did Hiccup. "Why does that bother you?" "I know that I'd rather forget my first time," Astrid replied, trying to make Hiccup feel better about the whole experience. But Hiccup just sighed and dropped his head, uncomfortable with admitting the truth. Because I always imagined it being special, you know. The first time with the girl that I'm probably going to want to spend the rest of my life with, and I can't remember any detail of it. Just, the feeling. Hiccup sighed again, embarrassed about admitting what was on his mind to the girl he was talking about. He just hoped Astrid was okay about all of this. Hey, she took Hiccup's hand into her own for a moment. If it makes you feel better, that's a lot better than having the memory of every detail that occurred during your first time. Like me. Astrid admitted, a small smile on her face as she tried to cheer him up. Hiccup's eyes changed slightly and he seemed intrigued by her words, forcing Astrid to tell Hiccup about her first time. Tell me, I want to know. Well, it was senior year and I was at prom with my boyfriend at the time. His name was Han, and looking back now, he was a jerk. I think the only reason he went out with me at that time was that he wanted to sleep with me. Anyway, we were at prom and we decided, for some unknown reason, to sneak into one of the bathroom stalls and have sex. I couldn't say no because